Hello everyone, and welcome back to the Horror Halloween. Now I know a lot of you use these videos to sleep, so before you drift off, I thought it would be a fun idea if everyone can leave a comment to let me know where you are listening from in the world. Also like and subscribe if you are enjoying the episodes. I had always been fascinated by old cemeteries. There was something about the quiet stillness, the feeling of stepping into another time. But I had never encountered a place like the one I visited last summer. It's a small, forgotten graveyard just outside of town. It's not on any map, not a place people talk about. In fact, most people around here don't even know it exists. But, for some reason, I had to see it. I couldn't explain it then, and I can't explain it now, but it felt like I was being drawn there. I first heard about it from an old woman at the grocery store. I was in the checkout line when I overheard her talking to the cashier. She mentioned a haunted graveyard up near the woods, and that caught my attention immediately. I tried to ask her more, but she didn't want to say much. She only looked at me with eyes that seemed to have seen far too much and whispered, "You shouldn't go there, dear. Trust me. Some things are better left forgotten." I didn't listen. My curiosity was stronger than her warning. The day I decided to explore, it was a gray, overcast afternoon. The clouds were thick, hanging low, and there was a chill in the air, even though it was the middle of summer. I took my bike and headed out of town, following the small trail that led into the woods. It wasn't a well-maintained path, just a thin line of dirt that seemed to twist and turn on its own. I thought it was strange, but the closer I got, the more the air seemed to thicken, and the more the hairs on the back of my neck stood up. After what felt like hours of walking, I found it. The graveyard was hidden behind a wall of trees, almost like it had been swallowed by the forest over the years. The gate was rusted and half open, barely hanging onto its hinges. The gravestones inside were old and weathered, their surfaces chipped and worn from years of neglect. Some were tilted at strange angles, as if they had been disturbed. The whole place felt wrong. As I stepped inside, I felt an immediate heaviness in the air. It wasn't just the silence. It was the kind of silence that presses down on you, like something was waiting, watching. I tried to shake it off, telling myself that it was just my imagination. But then I heard it. At first, it was a whisper, soft and distant, like the rustling of leaves. But there was no wind. I froze, straining to hear. The whisper grew louder, but still faint, as if it was coming from beneath the ground. It was almost like someone calling my name. "Hello?" I called out, my voice sounding too loud in the eerie silence. There was no response, just the unsettling sound of my own voice echoing through the graveyard. I stepped forward, slowly, unsure of what to do. The stones seemed to loom over me, their names and dates long forgotten, their faces obscured by moss and dirt. I walked past a particularly tall stone, and that's when I saw it. A crypt, half hidden behind some thick ivy. It was old, but it didn't look like the others. The air around it was colder, like a breeze was coming from inside, though there was no wind. I could feel my heart beating faster. My instincts screamed at me to turn around and leave, but I couldn't move. Something was pulling me in. I crept closer to the crypt, my footsteps muffled by the overgrown grass. The door was cracked open, just enough for me to see inside. It was dark, but I could make out shapes that seemed to move. I felt my breath catch in my throat as I took a step forward. That's when I heard the whisper again, but this time it was clear. "Help me." It was a woman's voice, weak and trembling. I don't know what came over me, but I stepped closer to the crypt. The door creaked as it opened wider, revealing a set of stairs that descended into darkness. My legs felt heavy, but I had to go down. I don't know why, but something inside me felt like I had no choice. The steps were cold and slippery, and the further I went down, the more I could hear the whispers. They weren't just voices anymore. They were faces, shadows moving in the dark. I could barely see anything, but the voices were all around me. I reached the bottom of the stairs and found myself in a small chamber, the walls damp with age. There were old wooden coffins lining the walls, their lids half open. But it wasn't the coffins that scared me. It was the shadows, shapes that seemed to flicker just out of the corner of my eye. Then, the voice came again, closer this time. Help me. I turned, my heart racing. There, in the far corner, was a figure. A woman, pale and ghostly, dressed in what looked like an old-fashioned gown. Her hair was wild, matted with dirt and leaves, and her eyes were empty, black as night. I wanted to scream, to run, but I couldn't move. She stepped closer, her feet not touching the ground, gliding over the stone floor. The air grew colder, and I could feel the weight of her gaze on me. "Please, help me," she whispered again. But this time her voice was different. It was sharp, desperate. I took a step back, but my feet were stuck, frozen in place. She reached out, her fingers long and bony, and I could feel the air around me grow even colder. Her touch would have been like ice if she had touched me, but I couldn't move. The shadows in the room seemed to close in on me, and the whispers grew louder. A cacophony of voices, all pleading, all crying for help. And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, everything went silent. The woman was gone. The shadows receded. The room was empty. I couldn't breathe. My chest felt tight. I turned and ran, my feet finally working again, carrying me up the stairs and back into the graveyard. I didn't stop until I was back at the gate, the wind whipping through the trees, and the feeling of being watched still hanging in the air. I never went back to that graveyard, and I never told anyone what happened. There are things you can't explain, things that don't make sense. All I know is that when I close my eyes at night, I can still hear those whispers calling from the depths of the earth, and every time I hear them, I remember the ghost in the crypt, still waiting for someone to help her. It was supposed to be just another school break, a chance to get away from the pressure of exams and homework. So when my best friend Jack suggested we take a trip to Black Hollow, a secluded village about an hour from town, I didn't think twice. We were both into history and legends, and the place was known for one thing: a haunted graveyard on the outskirts, with a crypt said to be cursed. It sounded like the perfect adventure. Little did I know, it would be the kind of adventure I would never forget. We packed our bags with snacks, a camera, and a couple of flashlights. We didn't tell our parents exactly where we were going. Black Hollow was one of those places people warned you about, but never really talked about. We knew that if we mentioned it, they'd never let us go. The drive was long, the kind where the roads twist and wind through dark forests, with nothing but the sound of the car's engine and the occasional hoot of an owl. It was late afternoon when we arrived, just as the sun began to dip below the horizon. The village itself looked like it had been stuck in time. The buildings were old, their paint peeling, the streets empty except for the occasional stray cat. There was a strange, heavy silence about the place, as though it was waiting for something to happen. We didn't stay long in the village. After a quick stop for gas, we headed straight for the graveyard. The cemetery was on the edge of town, hidden by a row of tall, gnarled trees. The air was thick, damp with the smell of moss and earth. The moment we stepped past the gate, a chill ran through me. The place didn't feel right. The graveyard was ancient, with gravestones that leaned and cracked, their inscriptions worn by time. Some had names, others didn't. There were rows of graves that stretched out for what seemed like miles, each one darker than the last. Jack was already several feet ahead of me, his flashlight sweeping across the stones as he muttered something about taking pictures. He was always the brave one, always eager to chase after the next thrill. I, on the other hand, felt uneasy. There was something about this graveyard that felt alive. Not in the way the trees or the wind were alive, but in a more sinister way. The kind of alive that made your skin crawl. "Come on, don't be a baby," Jack called from ahead, snapping a picture of a particularly worn grave. "I swear, this place is like straight out of a horror movie." I forced a smile, but my heart wasn't in it. I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. As we walked deeper into the graveyard, I noticed something odd. There was a crypt, half hidden behind an overgrowth of ivy and moss. It wasn't like the other graves. This one had an air of malevolence about it, a sense of something ancient and dangerous. I couldn't take my eyes off it. "Jack," I called softly, "do you see that?" He looked over his shoulder and laughed. "The crypt? Yeah, I saw it. Pretty creepy, right?" I don't know. It feels wrong, I said, my voice barely above a whisper. Jack shrugged, walking over to the crypt without a second thought. Wrong or not, it's still a cool photo op. You're such a scaredy cat. I hesitated but followed him. As we approached the crypt, I noticed the iron door was slightly ajar. It seemed to beckon us. The wind picked up, rustling the leaves in a way that felt unnatural. I looked at Jack, who was already reaching for the door. No, don't, I said quickly. Let's just go. This place isn't right. Jack stopped, looking at me with a smirk. Relax, man. It's just an old crypt. I've read about these things. Nothing to be afraid of. But as he pushed the door open, the air around us seemed to grow colder. A gust of wind blew through the graveyard, making the trees shake and groan. I felt a shiver run down my spine, and despite my fear, I couldn't stop myself from stepping closer. The crypt's interior was dark, the air thick with the smell of decay. There were no torches, no windows, just darkness. Jack shone his flashlight inside, revealing a set of stairs that led down into the depths. I could feel the ground beneath me shift, as if the earth itself was uneasy. We're going in, Jack said, his voice filled with excitement. No way. This is a bad idea. I protested, my heart racing in my chest. But Jack was already stepping down the stairs, his light bouncing off the walls as he disappeared into the dark. Against my better judgment, I followed. The staircase was narrow, each step creaking under our weight. It felt like the walls were closing in around us, the air growing thinner with each step. We reached the bottom, and Jack's flashlight revealed a small, stone chamber. There were old coffins lining the walls, some open, some closed, but all covered in dust. The stone floor was cracked, and there was a faint glow coming from the far corner. Did you see that? I whispered, my voice shaking. Jack nodded, his grin wide. Yeah, I did. Looks like something's down there. He made his way toward the glow, but I stayed where I was, too scared to move. The air felt thick, as if the darkness itself was alive and pressing in on us. I could feel my heart pounding in my chest, and every instinct in my body was telling me to run. But before I could move, I heard something, soft at first, like a whisper. It was coming from the corner where Jack was standing. Jack, I called out, my voice barely audible. He didn't answer. Instead, he reached out toward the source of the glow. His hand brushed against the stone, and that's when I saw it. A figure, pale and shadowy, standing in the corner. It wasn't a person, at least, not anymore. It was a shape, more like a shadow than anything else, with glowing eyes that seemed to pierce the darkness. Jack, I screamed, but he didn't turn. His eyes were wide, fixed on the figure. I tried to run toward him, but my legs felt frozen, my feet glued to the spot. I couldn't move. The figure raised its hand, and I saw Jack's body jerk as if it was being pulled toward it. He let out a strangled scream, his flashlight clattering to the floor as he was dragged into the darkness. My heart stopped. No, I screamed, finally finding the strength to move. But by the time I reached the spot where Jack had been standing, there was nothing. Just the cold stone floor and the smell of decay. I didn't stop to look back. I turned and ran, up the stairs, out of the crypt, and back into the graveyard. The wind howled around me, the trees shaking as if in anger. I didn't look to see if Jack was following me. I just kept running. By the time I made it back to the car, my chest was tight with fear. My hands were shaking as I fumbled for the keys. I drove as fast as I could, not stopping until I was back in the village, away from the graveyard and the cursed crypt. I didn't go back. I didn't even try to find Jack. The village, Black Hollow, was gone by the time I looked in my rearview mirror. I don't know what happened to Jack, but I know one thing for sure. The crypt of Black Hollow isn't just a story. It's real, and whatever is trapped down there, it doesn't want to be disturbed. So, if you ever find yourself near Black Hollow, stay away from the graveyard. Trust me, some places are meant to stay buried. Every town has its stories, the kind you hear whispered from one generation to the next, growing more mysterious and chilling with every telling. My hometown of Thornabrook was no different. The oldest and most infamous tale centered around Widow's Hill, a place that no one in their right mind would dare to go, especially after dusk. I'd heard the story many times growing up, always with a shiver in the voice of the person telling it. The story was about a crypt, a forgotten crypt that stood on the hill where the dead had been buried long ago. The crypt wasn't like any other in the town cemetery. It had been locked for years, the entrance buried by dirt and vines. People said it was cursed, but no one could explain why, and they didn't need to. Every child in Thornabrook knew the story, but it wasn't until I was 14 that I truly understood what made Widow's Hill so dangerous. It all started with a dare. One warm autumn afternoon, my friends and I were hanging out near the old stone wall that separated the town from Widow's Hill. We had just finished our homework and were passing time before dinner when the conversation turned to the crypt. Tom, one of the more adventurous kids in our group, challenged us to go up to the hill and see if we could get inside the crypt. We all laughed, dismissing it as another one of his wild ideas. But then he made it personal. You guys are all just scared. I bet none of you have the guts to even step foot in that graveyard. I bet you can't even find the crypt's entrance. I felt the challenge hanging in the air like a heavy weight. I didn't want to back down, but I also didn't want to go. I had heard the warnings, and I wasn't sure if I believed in the curse or not. It didn't matter, though. My pride got the better of me. "I'll go," I said before I could stop myself. Tom grinned, and that was that. We agreed to meet at dusk, when the shadows were long and the light was dim. The walk to Widow's Hill was only about half a mile from town, but it felt longer as we approached the hill. The sun had already started to set, casting an eerie orange glow over the landscape. A strange silence hung over the place, the wind barely stirring the leaves in the trees. My heart began to race with every step, but I kept walking. I wasn't going to let them think I was scared. When we reached the old cemetery, the iron gate was barely hanging on its hinges, rusted and covered in ivy. The graveyard was a neglected mess, overgrown with wild grass and broken gravestones. We had been here many times before, but tonight it felt different. The air felt heavier, thick with something I couldn't quite put my finger on. We walked past the first few graves, their names barely visible, worn away by the years. As we made our way deeper into the graveyard, the trees seemed to close in on us, casting long, stretching shadows that made the place feel even more claustrophobic. We all stayed close together, but even Tom seemed to hesitate when we reached the far corner of the graveyard, where the crypt was said to be. The crypt stood alone, partially hidden by an old stone wall that had collapsed in places. Vines snaked up the walls, their dark green leaves creating a thick curtain that covered much of the entrance. The stone was cold to the touch, as if the place had been abandoned for centuries. We knew that this was it, the forgotten crypt, the one that no one spoke of without a shiver. Tom pushed forward first, his flashlight sweeping the area as he searched for a way inside. "There's got to be a door somewhere," he muttered. I stood at the edge, feeling a strange pull in the air, as though the crypt was drawing me in. It didn't feel like a place of rest, it felt like a place of waiting. The shadows seemed to grow deeper the longer I looked at the entrance, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching us. But Tom wasn't listening to my hesitation. He was already pulling at the vines, trying to move them aside. With a grunt, Tom tore away the vines from a small opening in the stone. There, barely visible under years of neglect, was a rusted metal door. It was slightly ajar, but the darkness beyond it was impenetrable. "We found it," Tom said, his voice barely a whisper, as if speaking too loud might anger whatever was lurking inside. The air grew colder, and I felt a chill run down my spine. "Let's just leave, okay?" I said, my voice trembling. But the others were already moving forward, and before I knew it, we were all standing in front of the crypt's entrance. I wanted to leave, to turn around and go home, but my feet wouldn't move. It was like I was frozen in place, my body refusing to listen to the voice in my head that screamed at me to turn back. Tom shoved the door open with a creak, and we stepped inside. The darkness was thick, almost tangible, and the air smelled stale, like something had been sealed away for far too long. The flashlight flickered for a moment before it steadied, and we saw the walls of the crypt, a small, square room lined with stone coffins. There were 5 in total, all cracked and covered in dust. They looked as though they had been there for centuries, untouched by the world above. "This is it," Tom whispered, his voice full of excitement. "We found it." I couldn't bring myself to speak. I was overwhelmed by the silence, the darkness, and the feeling that something was wrong, terribly wrong. The temperature had dropped sharply, and I could feel a weight pressing down on me, as if the air itself was alive, watching us. I turned toward the far wall of the crypt, and that's when I saw it, a shadow. It was faint at first, just a blur in the corner of my eye, but as I stared at the spot, it grew clearer. It was the shape of a woman, tall and thin, dressed in a long, flowing black gown. Her face was obscured by shadows, but her eyes were like black pits, endless and empty. I gasped, backing away in horror. "What is that?" I managed to whisper, but no one seemed to hear me. Tom and the others were too busy exploring the coffins, oblivious to the shadow that was creeping closer. I could feel it, the weight of her presence pressing in on me, pulling at my very soul. I wanted to scream, to run, but my legs were locked in place. The shadow woman reached out, her hands like skeletal claws, and I could feel her icy breath on the back of my neck. I turned to flee, but as I did, the air seemed to shift, and the door slammed shut behind us. We were trapped. Panic surged through me as I slammed my fists against the stone door. "We need to get out. Now!" I shouted, but no one seemed to hear me. The others were staring at the coffins, lost in their own world. It was as if the crypt had taken hold of them, drawn them into its dark web. The shadow woman was closer now, her form growing clearer, her face twisted in a grotesque, silent scream. She reached out toward me, and I could feel the coldness of her touch, like death itself wrapping around me. I screamed and ran toward the back of the crypt, searching for an escape. But there was none. The walls closed in on me, the crypt now a prison from which there was no escape. Just as I thought I would be consumed by the darkness, the door flew open. The others were gone, lost in the shadows, and I was alone in the graveyard once more. I don't know how I managed to leave. I don't remember running down the hill or back to town. All I remember is the feeling of the shadow woman following me, always just out of reach, her cold fingers brushing against my skin. I never went back to Widow's Hill. No one ever did after that night. The crypt remains sealed, forgotten by time. But I know it's still there, waiting for the next fool to dare enter. If you ever find yourself near Thornabrook, don't go to Widow's Hill. Trust me, some places are better left untouched. Some graves should never be opened. I had always been fascinated by the stories that surrounded the old cemetery at Bell's End, a place I had passed countless times while growing up in the small, sleepy town of Harrowbrook. The cemetery was located at the edge of the town, on a hill that overlooked the valley below. At first glance, it didn't seem all that remarkable, just rows of old gravestones and a few weathered mausoleums. But as far back as I could remember, there were whispers, rumors, and strange tales about Bell's End Cemetery. The most chilling of them all was the story of the crying tomb. I'd heard the legend for years, from my parents, from older kids at school, and even from people I barely knew. They all said the same thing. The tomb, which sat at the far end of the cemetery, was cursed. It belonged to the Bell family, who had lived in Harrowbrook long ago. The family's tragic history was well known in the town. The Bell family had lost their only daughter, Sarah, to a fever when she was just 15. Sarah's death had devastated the family, and her father, John Bell, had vowed that his daughter's soul would never rest. After her death, he ordered that a grand tomb be built in her honor, right at the edge of the cemetery. The stone was said to be unlike any other, with carvings so intricate that they seemed to come alive under the right light. But here's where the story took a dark turn. According to the legend, John Bell had a mysterious visitor just days before the tomb was completed. The visitor was never identified, but people believed he was a man who could communicate with spirits. After this visit, things changed. John Bell was found dead in his home, a look of terror frozen on his face, and his wife was found soon after, in the same state. Their deaths were ruled as natural causes, but some said it was the curse of the crying tomb that had taken their lives. The real horror, however, began shortly after the Bells were buried in their tomb. It is said that every night, at exactly midnight, the sound of a woman crying could be heard coming from the tomb. The crying would echo through the cemetery, filling the air with an unsettling sadness. Some claimed it was Sarah's spirit, weeping for her lost family. Others said it was the sound of her mother, trapped in the tomb, mourning her daughter's death for eternity. The townspeople soon began to avoid the cemetery after dark, but there were always rumors. Those who ventured too close would hear the sobbing, and some claimed they had even seen a pale figure standing by the tomb, illuminated by the pale light of the moon. I had always dismissed these stories as just that, stories. After all, I thought, I had lived in Harrowbrook for most of my life, and I'd never seen anything out of the ordinary. But as I reached my senior year of high school, curiosity got the better of me. One autumn evening, after hearing yet another version of the story from one of my friends, I decided to go see the crying tomb for myself. I convinced my best friend, Sam, to join me. He was skeptical, too, but like me, he was drawn to the idea of uncovering the truth. It was a Friday night, and we were bored, so we decided to make the trip after the sun had set, knowing the cemetery would be empty. The walk to Bell's End Cemetery was only about 20 minutes from town, but as we approached the gates, I felt a strange sensation in my stomach. I couldn't explain it, but something about the place made my skin crawl. The cemetery was exactly as I remembered, quiet, ancient, and untouched by time. The iron gates were rusted, and the tombstones were worn with age, some barely legible. The path that led to the Bell family tomb was overgrown with weeds, and a thick fog had begun to roll in, making everything feel even more oppressive. "Are you sure about this?" Sam asked, his voice shaky as he glanced around the graveyard. "I mean, I'm not really feeling this anymore, but I was determined. We're just going to check it out. If nothing happens, we'll leave." Simple as that. We walked past rows of old graves, our footsteps muffled by the soft earth beneath us. The air was thick and still, and I couldn't help but feel like we were being watched. I kept telling myself it was just my imagination, but I couldn't shake the unease that had settled in my chest. When we reached the Bell family tomb, I couldn't help but feel a chill run down my spine. The tomb was different from the others. It was made of dark, polished stone, covered in elaborate carvings that seemed to shift in the moonlight. The door to the tomb was a massive slab of stone, with intricate symbols etched into it. Above the entrance was a plaque, barely visible due to the years of weathering. It simply read, "The Bell family, rest in peace." I stood in front of it for a moment, taking it all in. There was no sound, no movement, just the quiet stillness of the cemetery. But then I heard something, a faint sound, almost like the wind. But it wasn't the wind. It was a soft, mournful sobbing. The sound was so faint at first that I wasn't sure I had heard it at all. But then it grew louder, clearer, until it became unmistakable. The sound of a woman crying. I froze, my heart hammering in my chest. Sam was beside me, his face pale. "Did you hear that?" he whispered, his voice barely audible. I nodded, unable to speak. The crying was coming from the tomb. It sounded like it was coming from deep inside, like someone was weeping in agony. The sound was so raw, so filled with sorrow, that it sent a wave of dread washing over me. We stood there for what felt like an eternity, too scared to move, too scared to speak. The sobbing continued, growing louder and more desperate with each passing second. It was as though the very air around us was heavy with grief. "Maybe it's just an animal," Sam said, trying to reason with himself, but his voice trembled. "Some kind of animal trapped inside." But I didn't believe that for a second. This was something else. I could feel it in my bones, the weight of the sadness, the despair that seemed to pour out from the tomb itself. I couldn't take it anymore. "We need to leave," I said, my voice breaking through the quiet like a sharp, cold wind. "Now." We turned to run, but before we could move, a figure appeared in the mist. It was a woman, pale and ghostly, her long hair falling in wet tangles around her face. She stood by the tomb, her back to us, and as we watched in horror, she turned slowly. Her eyes were wide, hollow, filled with an emptiness that made my stomach churn. For a moment, Everything stood still. The air seemed to thicken, and the crying grew louder, almost deafening. The woman's lips parted, but instead of speaking, she let out a sound, a hollow, keening wail that pierced the night. I didn't wait to see more. I grabbed Sam's arm and dragged him away, my heart pounding in my chest. We didn't stop running until we were back in town, our breaths coming in ragged gasps. The next day, we tried to convince ourselves it was just our imagination. Maybe it was the fog, the isolation, or the stories that had gotten to our heads. But deep down, we both knew the truth. The crying tomb wasn't just a story, it was real. And whatever we had witnessed that night, it was not of this world. From that night on, I never went back to Bell's End Cemetery. Some things, I learned, are better left undisturbed. The tomb still stands, waiting for the next person foolish enough to approach it. And every night, at midnight, the sobbing continues. If you ever find yourself in Harrowbrook, remember this. The crying tomb isn't just a tale. It's a warning. Some places, some spirits, are not meant to be disturbed. Growing up in the small town of Ravenwood, I always found solace in the quiet beauty of nature. It was a town untouched by time, with old houses lined in cobblestone streets and endless forests surrounding us like a protective wall. But, like every small town, there was one place that everyone avoided, and it wasn't because it wasn't beautiful or peaceful. It was because it was cursed. Hollow Creek Cemetery. I had heard about it from the older kids at school. They told stories of strange things happening there. Whispers that echoed through the tombstones at night, figures moving between the gravestones, and the eerie feeling that you were never truly alone. Everyone knew about the cemetery, but no one ever went there. It was a place avoided, ignored, and forgotten by most, save for a few families who lived on the outskirts of town. The most chilling part of the stories, however, was about the crypt. It stood at the farthest corner of the cemetery, hidden behind a thick thicket of trees, with vines and moss growing over the stone structure. The crypt had been there for as long as anyone could remember, and the tales said that no one had entered it for generations. There was a rumor about it being cursed, that those who stepped inside never came out, or worse, they came out different. I always thought it was just a scary story to keep kids away, like the kind of tales you tell around campfires to get a thrill. But when I turned 16, I began to grow curious. The fear that gripped the townspeople only fueled my need to understand what made that place so terrifying. One autumn afternoon, when the air was still warm but the sun was starting to set, I decided to take a walk by the cemetery. It wasn't my first time seeing it from afar, but something about the setting sun made the place seem more sinister that day. The golden light seemed to make the gravestones glow with a ghostly hue, and for the first time, I truly felt the weight of its history. My curiosity was winning over my caution. I didn't want to be one of those people who would spend their life avoiding the unknown just because of a story. I wanted to see it for myself. So, I headed toward the cemetery, heart racing with anticipation and fear. I kept telling myself it was all just superstition, that nothing could be out of the ordinary. But as I approached the entrance, my stomach twisted, and I felt the weight of the air pressing down on me. The cemetery was eerily quiet, not a sound to be heard except the distant rustling of leaves. The iron gate creaked as I pushed it open, the smell of damp earth mixing with the cold, crisp air. The path ahead was narrow, with towering trees on either side that seemed to whisper as they swayed in the wind. The cemetery was overgrown, the grass tall and untamed, but the paths were still discernible, winding between the crumbling tombstones. I walked slowly, my footsteps muffled on the soft ground. A strange feeling settled over me, like I was being watched, but I shook it off. I was just letting the stories get to my head, I thought. But when I reached the farthest corner of the cemetery, where the crypt was said to stand, I stopped in my tracks. There it was, the crypt. It wasn't as grand as I had imagined, but it was imposing in its own right. The stone structure was weathered by centuries of neglect. Dark vines climbed up its walls, obscuring most of the carvings that once adorned its surface. A heavy iron door, rusted and broken, was partially open, a faint breeze stirring the air inside. The crypt loomed over me, casting a long shadow that stretched across the ground. I stood there for a moment, staring at the entrance, the weight of the stories pressing down on me. I couldn't go any further, could I? I had always been the kind of person who believed in logic, in the idea that things could be explained. But this felt different. The stories, the whispers, it all seemed to converge in this one place. I took a deep breath, deciding once and for all to face whatever awaited me. I took a step toward the crypt, and as soon as my foot hit the ground, the air seemed to change. It grew colder, and the world around me became deathly silent. There were no birds, no wind, no rustling of leaves, just the deafening quiet of the graveyard. I approached the crypt slowly, feeling the temperature drop with each step. The iron door creaked as I pushed it open further, the sound echoing through the cemetery like the scream of a long-dead soul. Inside, the darkness seemed to swallow everything. I fumbled for my flashlight, my hand trembling, and shined it inside. The beam flickered for a moment, casting shadows that seemed to dance along the walls. The crypt was small, with a stone floor and low ceilings. There were no coffins inside, just a few old, cracked urns and a large altar in the center of the room. The air was stale, thick with the scent of mildew and something else, something that smelled faintly of decay. I stepped in, my heart pounding in my chest, and immediately I felt it. A presence. It wasn't just the eerie silence or the cold air. There was something else, something intangible but very real. I could feel it, like fingers brushing against the back of my neck. The hairs on my arms stood on end, and I quickly turned to leave. But as I reached for the door, I heard it. A whisper. It was soft at first, almost indistinguishable from the wind. But then it became clearer, louder, and it seemed to come from all around me. The voice was a woman's voice, but it wasn't comforting. It was pleading, desperate. "Help me, please." I froze. The whisper wasn't coming from the walls or the air. It was coming from the crypt itself, from the very stones beneath my feet. The voice grew louder, the words more desperate, and I could hear the faint sound of sobbing. The sound made my stomach churn, my heart pounding in my chest. "Please, help me," the voice repeated, growing more frantic. "You have to help me." I turned, desperate to escape, but the door had slammed shut behind me. I pushed against it with all my strength, but it wouldn't budge. Panic surged through me as I pounded on the door, the whisper growing louder, more insistent. "Help me," it cried. "You have to." Then, the light flickered and went out. The cry of the woman stopped, and the silence that followed was suffocating. The darkness felt alive, pressing in on me, suffocating me. I fumbled for my phone, praying the flashlight would work, but it didn't. The room seemed to shrink around me, and I could feel something cold, icy cold, brush against my skin. A shadow passed by me, and I gasped, spinning around. There was no one there, only the empty walls of the crypt, now feeling like the tomb they were meant to be. But the sense of something watching me, something waiting, was stronger than ever. The whispers continued in my mind, filling me with a sense of dread that I couldn't shake. And then, as quickly as it had all started, the door creaked open. I bolted out of the crypt, my legs trembling beneath me. I didn't look back, not once, as I ran through the cemetery and back toward the gates. When I reached the edge of the graveyard, I paused to catch my breath, and that's when I saw it. At the entrance of the crypt, a shadow stood, tall and thin, with long, flowing hair. The figure was draped in tattered white robes, its face obscured by the darkness, but I could see its hands, pale, long fingers, reaching out toward me. I didn't stop to see if it followed me. I didn't want to know. I ran all the way back to town that night, never stopping until I reached my house. I couldn't explain what happened, and I didn't want to. All I knew was that the crypt, the whispers, the cold hands, they were real, and they were waiting. Hollow Creek Cemetery has been left untouched since that night, and I will never go near it again. There are some places where curiosity should never lead. Some things are best left alone, and the Whispering Crypt is one of them. If you ever find yourself in Ravenwood, remember this. Don't go near Hollow Creek Cemetery, especially at night, because sometimes, when you're close enough to listen, the dead don't want to be forgotten. They want to be heard. I always thought of myself as a person who didn't scare easily. Growing up in a small town like Black Hollow, you'd hear your share of ghost stories, but I'd long since learned to dismiss most of them. The old folklore, the haunted woods, and the rumors about our town's abandoned graveyards didn't faze me. I was more interested in exploring the history of our town than in believing in things that went bump in the night. But that all changed the night I decided to explore the Black Hollow Cemetery. The cemetery had always been a place of curiosity for me. As a kid, I'd pass it on my way home from school, always staring at the crumbling gravestones and the overgrown trees that seemed to reach out like skeletal hands. The cemetery had a long history. Some of the oldest graves in the town were there, dating back to the 1800s. But the real mystery lay in the mausoleum, an old stone structure tucked away at the farthest corner of the cemetery. It had always been said that the mausoleum held the remains of one of the town's wealthiest families, the Devereux family. I had heard the rumors. People said the mausoleum was cursed, and that anyone who ventured inside would never return. The Devereux family, according to the stories, had vanished mysteriously one night. No one knew exactly what happened to them, but their mausoleum remained untouched, locked, and almost forgotten over the years. The stories claimed that if you were foolish enough to enter the mausoleum, you'd hear whispers, or worse, see something that wasn't supposed to be seen. One crisp fall evening, I found myself with my friends, Lucas and Jenna, standing at the gates of the cemetery. The full moon hung high in the sky, casting an eerie glow on the headstones that surrounded us. We had heard the rumors about the mausoleum, of course, but tonight, we wanted to see for ourselves if there was any truth to them. I didn't believe in curses, and neither did Lucas or Jenna. "This is stupid," Jenna muttered as she nervously glanced over her shoulder. "Why are we doing this?" "I'll tell you why," Lucas said, pushing open the rusted gates. "Because we've heard the stories for years, and we're going to find out what's really going on. If we're not back in an hour, call the cops." Jenna rolled her eyes, but followed behind us as we stepped onto the path leading deeper into the cemetery. The wind rustled through the trees, the sound almost like hushed voices, but I brushed it off as just the wind. The cemetery was silent, save for the occasional creak of the gates as they swung in the breeze. We reached the mausoleum in what felt like no time at all. The mausoleum loomed before us, its stone walls covered in thick layers of moss and ivy. The heavy iron doors, twisted and rusted with age, were slightly ajar, as if inviting us inside. The closer we got, the more I felt a strange sensation creeping up my spine. It wasn't fear, it was something else, something darker. I glanced at Jenna, and I could see the unease written on her face. She opened her mouth to say something, but before she could speak, Lucas pushed the door wide open and stepped inside. The sound of the door groaning on its hinges echoed through the cemetery, sending a shiver down my back. "After you," Lucas said, grinning like he had won a dare. Jenna shot him a look, but reluctantly followed him into the darkness. I hesitated for a moment, staring into the blackness of the mausoleum's interior. It was cold inside, and the air felt heavy, as though it had been trapped in there for centuries. Despite the chill, the heat of curiosity burned in my chest. I followed them inside. The inside of the mausoleum was a vast, empty chamber, with only a few stone pillars supporting the ceiling. The floor was made of smooth marble, but it had cracks running through it, and the walls were covered in intricate carvings that seemed to depict some sort of ancient rituals. The dim light from the moon outside barely penetrated the darkness, and our flashlights only seemed to make the shadows grow longer. "This place is creepy," Jenna whispered, her voice shaking as she walked ahead of us. "It's fine," I said, trying to keep my own unease at bay. "It's just an old mausoleum. Nothing weird about it." But even as I said it, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The air felt stale and heavy, and there was a strange hum, like a faint whispering sound, filling the room. I could see Jenna's eyes darting around the space nervously, and Lucas, usually the brave one, seemed unusually quiet. We moved further into the mausoleum, the sound of our footsteps echoing off the stone walls. At the far end of the room was a large stone crypt. It was covered in more carvings, this time depicting the Devereux family. An elegant family, dressed in fine clothing, their eyes etched with solemn expressions. The crypt was closed off with a heavy iron grate, its edges rusted and broken in places. "This is it," Lucas said, pointing to the crypt. "This is where the Devereux family is supposed to be buried." Jenna leaned in closer, squinting at the inscriptions on the crypt. "Why is it so strange? It looks like they didn't even finish it. Why would they leave it like this?" Before I could respond, I heard it, a whisper. Soft at first, almost like the wind. But it wasn't the wind. It was a voice. "Leave now." I froze. My heart pounded in my chest, and I looked at Lucas and Jenna. They hadn't heard it. "What did you say?" Lucas asked, turning to me. Did you hear that?" I stammered. "Hear what?" Jenna looked around, her eyes wide. "Stop messing around. We need to go." But before I could respond, the whisper came again, louder this time. "Leave now." I felt a cold gust of air rush past me, like someone had opened a door somewhere. The sound of the wind wasn't the only thing I could hear now. It was like the walls were alive, the stone itself whispering in ancient tongues. I could barely understand the words, but I could feel them. They were warning us. "We need to go," I said, my voice shaking. "Now." But before we could turn back, the door to the mausoleum slammed shut, trapping us inside. "What the hell?" Lucas shouted, running to the door and pulling on it, but it wouldn't budge. Jenna was visibly panicking now, her breathing quick and shallow. "This isn't normal. We need to get out." That's when I saw it. A shadow moved across the far wall, a dark, twisting figure. It was unlike anything I had ever seen. It didn't have a face, no clear features, just a shape, dark and distorted, moving as if it were floating. The air grew colder, and the whispers grew louder. "Leave now." It was coming from all around us now, surrounding us, pressing in on us. The crypt before us seemed to glow faintly, and I saw something, a face, faintly visible in the carvings on the stone. It was the face of a man, twisted with anguish, his eyes wide and staring. "Run!" I screamed. We bolted toward the door, desperately trying to force it open. The shadows behind us seemed to follow, moving faster and faster, reaching for us. It felt like we were being hunted. With one final push, the door creaked open, and we stumbled out into the cold night air. The whispers stopped, but the oppressive feeling didn't leave us. We ran without stopping, not looking back, until we were safely outside the cemetery gates. We didn't say much as we walked back to town. The silence between us was thick with fear, each of us too scared to speak of what had happened. The Devereux mausoleum was no longer a mystery to us. It was a warning that some graves should never be disturbed. After that night, none of us ever spoke of it again. The cemetery stood as it always had, waiting for the next curious soul to wander in. But we knew better. Some places and some graves are better left alone. And the Devereux family's mausoleum is one of them. If you ever find yourself in Black Hollow, do yourself a favor. Stay away from the cemetery, especially at night. Some things aren't meant to be disturbed. Some whispers are better left unheard. I've never been the type of person to believe in ghosts or the supernatural. My life has always been grounded in logic, and I never gave much thought to the old stories about haunted places, until one night when I stumbled upon a truth that I couldn't explain. It happened in an old cemetery on the outskirts of town, a place I had walked past 100 times without thinking much of it. That night, I was with my best friend, Chris, looking for a place to hang out. We'd been out since sunset, walking around the edge of town and talking about anything and everything. As the night grew darker, we found ourselves near the old graveyard, a place that both intrigued and unnerved us. The cemetery had been around for decades, its gravestones weathered and cracked from years of neglect. But it wasn't just the age of the place that made it so eerie. It was the stories. The older people in town always whispered about the place, especially a certain section of the graveyard near the giant willow tree. They said that the tree was cursed, that something dark had happened there long ago. They even told us not to go near it. But of course, that only made Chris and I more curious. "Come on, let's just take a quick look," Chris said, his voice almost daring me. It's not like we'll be there long. We'll just check it out and leave. I wasn't so sure. Even though I didn't believe in ghosts, there was something unsettling about that cemetery. The moonlight seemed to cast an unnatural glow over the gravestones, and there was a strange silence that hung in the air, as if the whole place was holding its breath. But curiosity got the better of me, and I agreed. We walked through the rusty iron gates, the hinges squealing as they opened. The air felt colder as we stepped inside, and I could feel a strange heaviness in my chest, as if the very ground beneath my feet was pressing down on me. The further we walked, the more the place seemed to change. The path that had once been clearly visible became overgrown with ivy and thick vines, and the gravestones appeared to sink deeper into the earth, as though they were trying to hide from the world above. The trees that surrounded the cemetery grew taller, their branches twisted and gnarled, casting long shadows that seemed to move with the wind. We finally reached the center of the graveyard, where the old willow tree stood. Its trunk was massive, twisted, and covered in moss, with its branches hanging low, creating a dark curtain of leaves. Beneath it, there was a small crypt, its stone entrance almost completely obscured by the overgrown vegetation. It was unlike any crypt I had ever seen. Most crypts were plain, with a simple stone door and some carvings. But this one had intricate designs, almost like a puzzle. The vines and moss seemed to be guarding it, as though it was meant to be kept hidden. I felt an uncomfortable chill run down my spine as we approached the crypt. "Do you think anyone's ever been inside?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Chris shrugged. "Who knows? But the stories say that this place was sealed off years ago after something terrible happened." I was about to ask him what terrible meant when I heard a strange sound. It was soft at first, like a distant murmur, but it grew louder. It sounded like a voice, but I couldn't make out the words. It wasn't the wind. There was something more to it. "Did you hear that?" I asked, my heart beginning to race. Chris looked at me, his face suddenly serious. "Yeah, I did. It sounds like someone's crying." I froze. The air had grown colder, and the sound of the crying grew louder, more frantic, as if someone, or something, was in pain. The cries seemed to echo through the cemetery, bouncing off the gravestones, making it hard to tell where they were coming from. "We should go," I said, stepping back toward the gate, my instincts telling me to leave. But Chris didn't move. He was staring at the crypt with an intense look on his face. "I think we should check it out," he said, his voice oddly calm. "Maybe there's something inside. Maybe that's why people have been saying it's haunted." I didn't want to, but Chris was already moving toward the crypt. Against my better judgment, I followed him. We stood in front of the stone door, which appeared to be slightly ajar. The cries were louder now, filling the entire cemetery with their sorrowful wail. Without thinking, I reached out and pushed the door open. It creaked loudly, and as it swung wide, a cold rush of air hit us, carrying with it the smell of damp earth and something metallic, like blood. I shuddered, but Chris stepped forward, undeterred. Inside, the crypt was dark, with only the faintest glow of moonlight filtering through cracks in the stone walls. As our eyes adjusted to the darkness, we saw the shape of something lying on the stone floor, a figure. A woman, her long hair tangled and matted, her body twisted in unnatural ways. She was covered in dirt, her face hidden in shadow. I took a step back, my stomach turning. "Chris, we need to get out of here. Now." But Chris was transfixed, his gaze locked on the woman. "Who is she?" he whispered, taking another step closer. As he stepped forward, the woman's head jerked upward, and I gasped, stumbling backward. Her eyes were wide open, but they were completely black. No whites, no pupils, just endless darkness staring at us. "No," I shouted, grabbing his arm and pulling him back. "We need to leave." But it was too late. The woman let out a bone-chilling scream, a sound that seemed to echo from the depths of the earth itself. As her mouth opened, I could see her teeth, sharp and jagged, like those of a predator. Her body began to twitch and convulse, and in that moment, I realized something horrifying. She wasn't just a ghost. She was alive, or had been at some point. The crypt shook, the walls groaning as if they were alive. A cold wind blew through the open door, carrying with it the scent of decay and rot. "Run!" I screamed, pulling Chris toward the exit. But as we turned to leave, the crypt door slammed shut with a deafening crash, trapping us inside. I looked back at the woman, whose eyes were now fixed on us, her mouth still wide open in a silent scream. The cries, the whispers, the wind, it all grew louder. The walls seemed to close in on us, and the woman's presence felt overwhelming, suffocating. Her head snapped to the side, as though she was trying to speak, but no words came from her mouth. Instead, the crypt filled with a guttural sound, a low, vibrating hum that shook the very foundation of the tomb. "Chris, please help me," I begged, my voice trembling. I didn't know what was happening, but I knew we were in danger. Chris turned to me, his face pale. I can't move." I turned to him, and my heart stopped. His eyes were wide, but his body was frozen, as if he had been turned to stone. His skin was growing pale, and I could see the color draining from his face. "Chris," I screamed, shaking his arm, but it was no use. He was stuck, trapped in place. The woman's form began to rise from the floor, her long, bony arms reaching out toward him. Her fingers, long and claw-like, scraped against the stone floor as she moved. I didn't think. I didn't hesitate. I ran. My legs felt like lead, but I pushed through the fear, sprinting toward the door. Somehow, by some miracle, the door opened. I didn't look back. I didn't care what was behind me anymore. I just ran, out of the crypt, through the cemetery, and into the safety of the street. When I finally stopped, I was panting, my heart racing. I looked around, but Chris was gone. I didn't know what had happened to him, whether he was still in the crypt or somewhere else. All I knew was that the woman was real, and the crypt beneath the willow tree was not a place for the living. I haven't gone back to Black Hollow Cemetery since that night. I don't know what happened to Chris, but I do know this. Some places, some crypts, should never be disturbed, and the crypt beneath the willow tree? It's best left forgotten. If you ever find yourself near Black Hollow, take my advice. Stay far away from the cemetery. There are things buried there that are better left undisturbed. It was late October when I first heard the stories about Graymoor Cemetery. A friend of mine, Emma, had told me about it, and while I didn't think much of it at the time, something about her expression stuck with me. Emma wasn't the type to scare easily. She was practical, logical, and never believed in ghost stories. But that night, when she mentioned Graymoor, her voice wavered. She didn't tell the stories like she usually did, joking and laughing. This time, her tone was serious. It was almost as if she was warning me. "You've heard of Graymoor, right?" she asked one afternoon after school. I shook my head. "No. What's that?" "It's a cemetery. But not just any cemetery," she said, glancing around, as if someone might overhear her. "It's different. People say it's haunted. They say there's something in the crypt that doesn't belong." I didn't take her seriously. I mean, we were in high school, and everyone knows teenagers love to tell exaggerated ghost stories. But still, something about her words lingered in my mind. The next weekend, when I was walking home from a friend's house and found myself passing by Graymoor, I couldn't resist. I had to see it for myself. Graymoor Cemetery wasn't large, but it was ancient. The gates were rusted, and the iron fencing was overgrown with creeping vines. The place was quiet, almost too quiet, as if it were a forgotten part of the world. I stood there for a while, just looking at it. The gravestones were old, some cracked and weathered by time, others half buried in the ground. The cemetery wasn't cared for much anymore, and the air felt heavy, weighed down with a strange stillness. I didn't want to go in. I told myself I was just curious, just seeing what it was like. The way Emma had talked about it made it seem like something I should stay away from, but curiosity won out. I walked past the gate, feeling the cold breeze rush over me. It was like the cemetery had its own chill. My breath came out in little puffs of mist, even though it wasn't that cold yet. I wandered deeper into the cemetery, looking at the old stones. Some of them were unreadable, the names faded away by years of weathering. There were no other visitors, no caretakers, just silence. As I walked further, I noticed an old crypt at the back of the cemetery, standing isolated from the rest of the graves. It was large and imposing, made of dark stone, with intricate carvings running along its walls. The air around it felt colder, and for a moment, I thought I heard something. A whisper, faint, but there. I shook it off. The wind can do strange things around old places like this. I approached the crypt, my heart pounding a little faster than it should have. There was no reason for me to be nervous. It was just an old crypt, just a part of the cemetery like the others. But there was something different about this one. Something off. The carvings on the door seemed to move in the light, almost like they were shifting, rearranging themselves. I took a step back, suddenly feeling very uneasy. Maybe Emma had been right. Maybe there was something here. I tried to ignore the growing sense of dread creeping into my bones. I wasn't a superstitious person, but standing in front of that crypt, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. I decided to leave, but as I turned to walk away, I heard it again, whispers. Low, almost inaudible. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. I turned around quickly, expecting to see someone standing there, maybe a caretaker or another visitor. But there was no one. The crypt was empty, as it had been when I first arrived. But the whispers didn't stop. I felt the cold air press in on me. My breath caught in my throat. The whispers seemed to come from the crypt itself, rising in volume. They were soft at first, like distant voices, but soon they grew louder, almost pleading. Help! I froze. The voice was a woman's, and it sounded desperate. I knew I shouldn't get closer, but I found myself drawn to the crypt. The whispers beckoned me, urging me to come closer, to listen. I stepped toward the door. My hand hovered near the stone. I had to know. What was this place? Why did it feel like the cemetery itself was alive? As soon as my fingers brushed the cold stone of the crypt's door, the ground beneath me shook. The air vibrated with a low hum, and I heard the voice again, louder this time. Help me. The door of the crypt creaked. It wasn't just the wind. It was as if something inside was trying to escape. My heart raced, and I could feel my pulse in my throat. I should have run, but I didn't. Instead, I pushed against the door, and with a slow, agonizing groan, it began to open. The crypt was dark inside, but I could make out something. A shadow, a figure, moving just beyond the threshold. The whispers were stronger now, almost like a chant, repeating over and over, "Help me, help me." They seemed to echo off the walls of the crypt. I took a step forward, my feet moving of their own accord. I shouldn't have gone in, but something inside me urged me to. Inside, the air was cold, colder than outside. It felt damp, like the place hadn't been touched in decades. I could see faint outlines of stone coffins, their lids half open, as if something had disturbed them. The smell was strange, musty and sharp, like the scent of decay, but also something metallic, like rust. And then I saw it, a figure in the shadows. It was a woman, her body twisted and contorted in unnatural ways. She was draped in old, tattered clothes that seemed to fall apart as she moved. Her eyes, those hollow, empty eyes, stared directly at me. I tried to scream, but the air in the crypt was thick, suffocating. My voice wouldn't come. The woman raised one hand, her fingers elongated, sharp like claws. She moved closer, her head tilting to one side, as if she was studying me. Her mouth opened, but no words came out. Instead, the whispers grew louder. The air in the crypt grew colder still, and the whispers began to swirl around me, drowning out everything else. I stumbled back, panic rising in my chest. My legs were shaky, my hands cold with fear. What was she? Why was she here? The woman didn't answer, but the whispers did. They've been waiting, the voice said, clear and chilling. You shouldn't have come. I didn't need to hear any more. My body was moving before my mind could fully process what was happening. I turned and ran, slamming the door of the crypt behind me as I bolted toward the cemetery gate. The whispers followed me, growing fainter the further I got, but I could still hear them, tugging at my thoughts, trying to pull me back. When I reached the gate, I didn't stop. I didn't look back. I just ran. My chest was tight, and my breath came in ragged gasps. I didn't stop until I reached the main road. The air felt lighter out there, but the images of the crypt, the woman, the whispers, they haunted me. I couldn't shake the feeling that something had followed me, that something was waiting for me to return. I didn't know who or what the woman was, but one thing was certain. Graymoor Cemetery was not a place for the living. For days after, I couldn't shake the whispers from my mind. They echoed in my thoughts, pulling at me, warning me of something I couldn't fully understand. And every time I closed my eyes, I saw the woman, her hollow eyes staring at me, her claws outstretched. The cemetery is still there, untouched by time, but I've never gone back. I don't think I ever will. The whispers still haunt me, a warning from a place I'll never fully understand. And if you ever find yourself near Graymoor Cemetery, do yourself a favor, don't listen to the whispers. Don't let them draw you in. Some things, once awakened, are better left undisturbed. I never thought of myself as a person who believed in ghost stories or haunted places, but sometimes the world has a way of proving you wrong, and the story I'm about to tell you, one I've never shared with anyone else, changed everything. It all started last summer when my friends and I decided to go camping in a place called Hollowbrook Woods. It wasn't a national park or anything famous, just a quiet stretch of trees and a trail that led to a small, old graveyard no one really paid attention to anymore. We were supposed to be out there for a weekend of hiking and bonfires, away from the distractions of school and the usual day-to-day life. The woods themselves weren't that unusual. A bit overgrown, a little mysterious with their twisted trees and silent paths, but nothing that screamed haunted. But one afternoon, while exploring the farthest edge of the forest, we stumbled upon something unexpected. It was a gate, old, rusted, and covered with ivy. A wooden sign dangled from the gate, weathered and cracked. It said only 2 words, Hollow Graveyard. We all stared at it, curiosity lighting up our faces. No one had mentioned anything about a graveyard in the woods. No one had warned us that we were near one, and we wondered why it wasn't marked on any map of the area. The air around the gate felt thick, almost as if something was pressing down on us, but we couldn't place why. The gate creaked as we pushed it open, the hinges groaning from years of neglect. We stepped inside, our feet crunching on the dry, fallen leaves. The cemetery wasn't large, just a handful of gravestones scattered throughout the area. Most of the stones were worn down with time, their names barely readable. Some of the graves were sunken in, the earth disturbed, like the dead had been forgotten long ago. But what stood out the most wasn't the state of the graveyard, but the air around it. Even though it was a warm summer day, there was a strange chill in the air inside the gates. It wasn't just the cold, though. It was the silence. A silence that felt too thick, too heavy, as if the world outside the graveyard was moving. But here, everything was still. We wandered around for a bit, reading the names on the gravestones, taking pictures, making jokes, and pretending we weren't creeped out. But as the sun started to set, something changed. We didn't see it right away, but the atmosphere around us began to shift. The air grew heavier, colder. The sky, which had been clear just moments before, started to cloud over, turning the once warm evening into something darker. That's when we heard it, a soft whisper. At first, we thought it was the wind or perhaps one of us trying to be funny, but when the whisper came again, clearer this time, it sent a shiver down my spine. "Help me." We froze. I looked around, but there was no one else. Just the 5 of us standing among the graves. I called out, asking if anyone had heard that, but no one answered. They looked at me like I was crazy. "It was probably just an animal or something," said Jenna, the practical one in the group, but even she sounded a bit unsure, as if the whisper had unsettled her too. We tried to ignore it, but the whispering continued. It was faint at first, and we thought it might have been the wind passing through the trees, but soon it became more distinct. The words grew clearer, almost desperate. "Please, help me." I turned to look at one of the graves, and for the first time, I noticed something strange. One of the gravestones was different from the others. It wasn't weathered or cracked, like the rest. It was newer, still looking fresh despite the years it must have been there. The stone was a dark, almost black color, and it seemed out of place among the others. Without thinking, I walked toward it. The others followed, and we all stood around the grave, reading the name carved into the stone. It read, Elias Weaver. The date of death was recent, far too recent for a grave in a cemetery like this. It said 1993. As soon as I read the name, the air grew even colder. My breath came out in a visible mist, despite the warmth of the day, and the whispering stopped. Instead, a deep silence filled the space. The kind of silence that presses against your chest, making it harder to breathe. Then, the ground beneath us trembled. It was subtle at first, like a vibration, a shift in the earth, but it grew stronger, the tremors shaking the very ground we stood on. And then, something else happened. The grave of Elias Weaver began to shift. We all backed away, staring in horror as the earth around the grave began to move, like something was stirring beneath the soil. At first, it was just a small shift, but then the ground cracked open, and with a sound that was almost like a scream, the coffin inside was thrown from the earth, landing with a thud. The lid of the coffin flew open, revealing something that I'll never forget. Inside was not a body. No, that would have been too simple. What lay inside that coffin was a figure, twisted and grotesque. A man, or something that had once been a man. His skin was pale and stretched thin over his bones, and his eyes were wide open, hollow, staring at us with an intensity that made my blood freeze. His mouth opened, but instead of words, a sound like a groan filled the air. His mouth moved, but it was the same whisper we had heard earlier. Help me, please. At that moment, I knew we had made a mistake. We shouldn't have come here. We shouldn't have opened that grave. Before any of us could react, the figure in the grave began to rise, pulling itself from the coffin with an unnatural speed. The air was thick with the stench of decay, and I felt bile rise in my throat. I wanted to scream, to run, but my body wouldn't move. My feet were rooted to the ground, my heart pounding in my chest. Then, the whispering grew louder, a chorus of voices joining in. It was coming from the graves, from all around us. Thousands of voices, faint but insistent, calling out for help. Help me, help me. It felt like the whole cemetery was alive with the voices of the dead. It wasn't just one spirit, it was a whole cemetery full of them, all calling out, all reaching for us, their unseen hands begging for release. The man, if you could even call him that, stared at us with those hollow eyes, his mouth moving, but no sound coming out. Then, as quickly as it had all started, he collapsed back into the grave. The earth closed around him, sealing him away again, leaving nothing but the cracked ground and the faint echo of the whispers. Without a word, we turned and ran. We didn't stop to look back. We didn't stop to see if the ground shifted again or if the voices followed us. We just ran, the weight of the cemetery pressing down on us the entire way. We didn't stop until we reached the edge of the woods, panting, exhausted, and terrified. When we finally made it back to the camp, we couldn't shake the feeling that something was still with us. The whispers, the groans, the strange, twisted figure. It all stayed with us, haunting our thoughts long after we left the woods. To this day, none of us ever talk about Hollowbrook Woods or the graveyard. We don't even bring it up. But sometimes, late at night, I can hear it. Those whispers, calling to me from the dark. If you ever find yourself near a place called Hollowbrook, stay far away from the woods. And if you ever come across a gate-marked hollow graveyard, turn around. You don't want to know what lies beneath. Some graves are meant to stay closed. Some stories should never be uncovered. I never believed in haunted places. I used to think it was all just stories people told to entertain themselves or scare others. But that all changed the night I visited Ashford Hill Cemetery. I was just a kid back then, no older than 17, but the memory of that night still haunts me to this day. Ashford Hill wasn't a place anyone talked about much. It was tucked away in the middle of a small, sleepy town, and most people avoided it. Not because of anything specific, but because it was a place people just didn't go to. It had been abandoned for years, and its gates were rusted shut, covered with vines and old leaves that made the cemetery look like something out of a forgotten nightmare. I had heard rumors about Ashford Hill growing up. Kids would dare each other to go into the cemetery at night, and I always dismissed it as nothing more than urban legends. People said strange things happened there, whispers in the night, figures moving between the graves, and lights flickering in the distance. But I wasn't the type to fall for ghost stories. Still, curiosity got the better of me one summer evening when my friends dared me to go to Ashford Hill. It was a warm night when we arrived, the sky painted in shades of pink and purple as the sun began to set. The air was thick with the smell of damp earth and the distant hum of cicadas. We didn't know much about the place, just that it was an old cemetery that had been abandoned decades ago. There were rumors that a family named Ashford had been buried there, and that they had mysteriously disappeared from town in the early 1900s. The gate creaked as we pushed it open, and I could feel the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. It wasn't just the physical discomfort that made me uneasy. It was something else, something in the air that didn't feel right. My friends and I walked deeper into the cemetery, our footsteps crunching on the gravel path. The gravestones were old, some cracked and leaning, others half buried by time and weeds. A few were so weathered that I couldn't even make out the names. As we walked further into the cemetery, the atmosphere grew colder, and I could see my breath in the air, even though it was still summer. We joked and laughed, trying to shake off the feeling of unease that hung over us. But something about the place seemed off. The silence was unnerving. There wasn't a single bird chirping, no sound of animals moving in the underbrush, just an eerie quiet that seemed unnatural. Then, we came across it. A crypt, standing alone in the center of the cemetery. It was different from the other graves. Larger, made of dark stone, with intricate carvings running along its surface. The crypt's entrance was a heavy iron door, old and rusted, but still mostly intact. I couldn't help but feel drawn to it, like something was pulling me toward it. My friends didn't seem as interested, though. They stayed behind, chatting nervously, while I stepped forward. As I approached the crypt, I felt a cold wind brush against my skin, and the temperature seemed to drop even further. It wasn't a gust of wind, but more like the air around the crypt itself was colder than anywhere else in the cemetery. I reached out to touch the iron door, and as my fingers brushed against the metal, a low creaking sound echoed in the air, like something shifting inside. I pulled my hand back quickly, my heart pounding. I wasn't sure what I had expected, but the feeling of being watched hit me like a wave. I glanced over my shoulder, and for a split second, I thought I saw a figure standing among the gravestones. I blinked, and the figure was gone. I tried to convince myself it was just my imagination, but the unease didn't go away. My friends called out to me, telling me to come back, but I couldn't tear myself away from the crypt. I wasn't sure why, but something about it felt like it had a secret, something hidden that needed to be uncovered. I walked up to the door again, and this time, I pushed it open. The door creaked as it moved, and as it slowly swung open, I could feel the temperature drop even further. The air inside the crypt was thick, like the very walls were holding their breath. Inside, it was pitch black. I couldn't see anything, but I could feel the weight of the darkness pressing in on me. It was like the crypt was waiting for me to enter, like it had been calling me. I stepped inside, my breath coming in short gasps. The floor beneath my feet was covered in dust, and the walls were lined with cobwebs. There were several stone coffins inside, their lids cracked open, but there was something else, something far worse than anything I could have imagined. In the center of the crypt was a large stone pedestal, and on it lay an old, tattered book. It was bound in black leather, its edges worn and cracked. The book seemed to glow faintly in the dim light, and as I approached it, I felt a strange pull, as if the book was calling to me, urging me to open it. I reached out, my fingers trembling as I touched the cover. The moment my hand made contact, a low, rumbling sound filled the crypt, like something deep within the earth had stirred. I pulled my hand away, heart racing, but the book remained still. I took a deep breath, trying to steady myself, and with a shaking hand, I opened the book. The pages inside were yellowed and fragile, but the writing was still legible, though it was written in an unfamiliar language. I couldn't understand the words, but as I turned the pages, a cold wind suddenly rushed through the crypt, extinguishing the small amount of light that had been coming from outside. The crypt was plunged into total darkness, and I could feel the air around me grow thicker, colder, as if the very walls were closing in. And then I heard it, a whisper. At first, it was barely audible, just a faint sound, but as I turned another page, it grew louder, clearer, until I could hear a voice that seemed to be coming from all around me, from the very walls of the crypt. "Return it." The voice was low, almost a growl, and it sent a chill down my spine. My fingers froze on the pages of the book, and I felt a cold pressure on my chest, like something was standing right behind me. I tried to turn around, but I couldn't move. It was like the darkness had a hold on me. "Return it," the voice repeated, this time more insistent, and I could feel the air vibrating with the force of its words. I quickly slammed the book shut, but it didn't stop. The voice grew louder, more desperate, and I could feel the ground beneath my feet shaking. I tried to run, but my legs wouldn't move. It was like the crypt had become a prison, trapping me inside. The whispers surrounded me, filling my mind with images of ancient rituals, of forgotten graves, of things better left undisturbed. Suddenly, I felt a cold hand on my shoulder. I whipped around, but there was no one there. I was alone, standing in the center of the crypt, but I could feel the presence of something ancient, something powerful. My heart pounded in my chest as I tried to pull away from the invisible grip that seemed to be holding me in place. The whispers grew louder, now filling my ears, drowning out everything else. I could feel my body shaking, my mind slipping, as if I were losing control of my own thoughts. The temperature inside the crypt dropped to freezing, and I could see my breath forming in the air. "Return it." The voice was no longer a whisper. It was a scream. Without thinking, I bolted for the door. I ran as fast as I could, my heart hammering in my chest. The whispers followed me, growing louder with each step. The air was thick, the darkness pressing against me, but somehow I made it to the door. I pulled it open and stumbled out of the crypt, gasping for air. The cemetery was still. The air was no longer cold, and the oppressive feeling had lifted, but I knew something had changed. I knew that I had disturbed something in that crypt, something that was not meant to be disturbed. I ran back to my friends, who were waiting at the edge of the cemetery, too terrified to come any closer. They didn't need to ask what had happened. They could see it in my face. The terror, the dread. I didn't speak of what I had seen, what I had heard, but I could feel it lingering in my mind, that voice calling out to me. And when I closed my eyes that night, I heard it again, louder than ever. "Return it." I still remember the exact moment I first saw the Dreadmore Crypt. It was during a weekend road trip with some friends, far away from our suburban neighborhood. We were seeking adventure, and like most teenagers, we were drawn to places that were whispered about in the town but never discussed openly. It didn't take much searching online to discover the crypt, an old burial site in a town that seemed to have been forgotten by time. But no one had mentioned that it wasn't a place for the living. It started when we pulled into the small town of Dreadmore, a forgotten place on the outskirts of civilization. The air felt heavy there, like something pressing down on me. It wasn't the humidity, and it wasn't the weather. It was as though the town itself was holding its breath, waiting. A few dilapidated houses lined the road, their paint peeling, windows boarded up. Everything looked abandoned, except for the old cemetery at the edge of town. From the outside, it looked like a typical graveyard, old headstones scattered between trees. But something about it made me uneasy. It was as though it had been waiting for us. We parked the car just outside the cemetery gate. As we climbed out of the vehicle, I felt an odd sense of dread settle in my chest. The air smelled of damp earth and mildew, but there was something more, a faint scent of decay that lingered in the breeze. We didn't speak much. We just stood there for a moment, staring at the darkening cemetery in front of us, where shadows grew long, and the sun began to dip behind the trees. "Are we really going in?" my friend Mark asked, his voice barely a whisper, as if afraid someone might hear him. "Yeah, come on," I said, trying to sound confident. "It's just an old cemetery. Nothing to be afraid of." But even as I spoke, I felt my own confidence waver. I turned to the others, and they all seemed just as unsettled as I was. Karen, the most adventurous of our group, had already made up her mind. "I'm going in," she said, determination in her voice. With that, we followed her through the rusted gates and into the cemetery. The path was overgrown with vines and weeds, making it hard to walk without tripping. We stepped cautiously, the ground soft beneath our feet, and the air, even though cool, felt dense and oppressive. The headstones were worn, some half sunken into the ground, with names and dates that had long since faded. We wandered deeper, each step taking us further away from the faint light of the outside world. As we passed row after row of crumbling tombstones, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. The wind had picked up, rustling the trees, but the feeling of unease only deepened. There was a strange silence to the place, too, a silence that felt unnatural, as though the dead were listening to us, waiting. Then we saw it. At the farthest end of the cemetery, hidden behind a thick screen of trees and underbrush, was the crypt. It was different from the other graves. Much larger, made from dark stone, its entrance a massive iron door that had long since rusted over. The crypt loomed like a dark sentinel, casting an eerie shadow over the graveyard. There was something menacing about it, like it was guarding something it didn't want us to find. Without thinking, Karen led the way toward it. The closer we got, the more oppressive the air felt, and the colder it seemed. By the time we reached the crypt, I could feel the temperature drop noticeably, like we had crossed an invisible line into something far darker. The stone steps leading up to the door were slick with moss, and the iron door, despite its decay, was tightly shut. "Look at this," Karen said, reaching out to brush her fingers across the door. Her touch seemed to disturb the air, and as she did, the door gave a low, guttural groan, almost as if it were alive. For a brief moment, I thought I saw something move inside, a flicker of shadow, but when I blinked, it was gone. "That's not normal," Mark muttered, his voice shaky. "Let's just check it out," I said, trying to sound braver than I felt. But in truth, I was terrified. Everything about this place felt wrong. The air felt heavier here, like the weight of centuries pressed down upon us. I could feel the hairs on the back of my neck stand up as we stared at the crypt's entrance, the dark recesses within seeming to watch us. We all stood there, frozen for a moment. Then, as if drawn by some unspoken pull, Karen grabbed the handle of the door and yanked it open. It creaked loudly, echoing through the graveyard, and I felt a chill that made me shiver. The inside of the crypt was pitch black. There were no lights, no candles, just an overwhelming sense of darkness that seemed to consume everything. Despite the overwhelming urge to turn and run, we couldn't tear ourselves away. "Should we go inside?" Karen asked, her voice hesitant now. Before anyone could respond, something strange happened. From deep within the crypt, a faint, low whisper echoed through the darkness. At first, I thought it was the wind, but the more I listened, the more I realized the voice was speaking to us. "Leave. Leave now." The voice was soft but clear, like a warning, and it chilled me to the bone. Mark took a step back, his face pale, but Karen, as stubborn as ever, took a step forward. "I'm going in," she said firmly. "Are you coming or not?" None of us dared to speak. We just stood there, watching her. But when she took another step into the crypt, the door slammed shut behind her with a loud bang. I jumped, startled. But when I turned to look at Mark and the others, they were just as stunned as I was. The door wouldn't open. No matter how hard we pulled or pushed, it remained solidly shut. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, like an unseen presence closing in on us. "Karen," I shouted, panic rising in my chest. "Get out of there." But there was no response. Then, we heard it, a low, guttural growl from deep within the crypt. It wasn't the wind. It wasn't an animal. It was something else, something that didn't belong in the world of the living. The ground beneath our feet began to shake, and the whispering turned to chanting. The walls of the crypt seemed to pulse, as if they were alive, pressing in on us, trapping us. "Karen, get out now," I screamed, pounding on the door. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, the door opened, swinging wide. But Karen wasn't there. We rushed inside, our hearts pounding in our chests. The air inside the crypt was thick with a foul, cloying scent, and the temperature had dropped to near freezing. The walls were covered in strange, ancient symbols, their meaning lost to time. The air felt heavy with sorrow and fear, as if the crypt had been holding something for centuries. We found Karen in the center of the crypt, standing motionless. Her face was pale, her eyes wide open but unseeing, like she wasn't even there. "Karen," I shouted, shaking her by the shoulders. "Snap out of it." But she didn't respond. Her body was cold to the touch, and when I looked closer, I saw something that made my stomach turn. Her skin had started to look wrong. It wasn't the natural pale of someone who had been frightened or tired. It was as if something had taken hold of her, draining her life. Suddenly, the crypt seemed to shake again, and the air grew thick with an overwhelming sense of dread. I turned around to see the stone tombs beginning to shift, their lids creaking open. Shadowy figures began to rise from the coffins, their forms dark and twisted. They moved silently, their empty eyes fixed on us. I don't remember much of what happened next. I remember running, pulling Karen's limp body from the center of the crypt, and stumbling toward the door, which opened effortlessly this time. We didn't stop until we were out of the cemetery and back in the safety of our car. We never spoke about that night again, not even to each other. But I know what I saw, and I know what we disturbed. The Dreadmore Crypt wasn't just a burial place. It was a prison, a place that contained something dark and ancient, something that should have never been disturbed. And I don't think it will ever let us forget what we did. If you ever find yourself in a place called Dreadmore, stay far away from the crypt. Some things are buried for a reason. Some things should never be uncovered. I used to be an avid explorer of abandoned places, particularly old graveyards and crypts. The idea of stepping into a place that time had forgotten always gave me a strange thrill. I didn't believe in ghosts or spirits, not until that one night at Ravenshade Crypt. It was a rainy night in late October when I first heard about it. A friend of mine, Adam, mentioned a crypt at the edge of town, a place known to few but talked about in hushed voices by the older generations. He said it was cursed, that it held the remains of a family who had vanished mysteriously over 100 years ago. The crypt was said to be hidden deep within Ravenshade Cemetery, a place that was hardly ever visited, even by locals. "Why don't we go check it out?" Adam suggested one evening, as we sat around a campfire in the woods. "We could sneak in tonight and see what's left of the crypt." I had heard rumors about Ravenshade, but nothing concrete. The cemetery had been abandoned for as long as I could remember. Its gates rusted shut, and most of the headstones were either damaged or completely unreadable. But the crypt, that was something special. They said it was different from the other graves, larger, more intricate, with strange symbols carved into the stone. At first, I hesitated. Something about it felt wrong. But curiosity got the better of me, and before long, Adam and I were making our way toward the cemetery. The air was damp with rain, and the ground was slick, but we didn't mind. We had flashlights in hand, and the thrill of discovery was all we needed. The cemetery was located just beyond the outskirts of town, bordered by thick trees that looked almost like a wall around the area. The moment we stepped inside, I felt a strange chill in the air, despite the warmth of the rain-soaked evening. It wasn't just the temperature. It was as if the very ground beneath my feet was alive with something ancient, something I couldn't quite understand. We walked deeper into the cemetery, our footsteps muffled by the wet ground. The headstones were old, some leaning at odd angles, others half buried in the overgrown grass. The place felt abandoned, lost to time, with only the sound of rain tapping against the leaves above us. The air was heavy, thick with the smell of wet earth and decay. There were no birds, no insects, no sounds of life. It felt like we were the last living souls in the world. We came to the center of the cemetery, and that's when I saw it. The Ravenshade Crypt stood there, an imposing structure of dark stone that seemed to rise from the earth like a sentinel. It was unlike anything I had seen before. Tall, with arched windows that were now nothing more than shattered frames. The door, an ancient wooden affair, hung slightly ajar, as if inviting us inside. I wasn't sure why, But as I looked at it, a feeling of unease crept up my spine. I had explored many places before, but there was something about this crypt, something that made my heart race with fear. "Let's go in," Adam said, clearly excited. He pushed the door open with a creak, and without waiting for me, he stepped inside. Reluctantly, I followed. The air inside the crypt was cold, much colder than it should have been for a warm evening like this. The smell of decay was even stronger inside, mingled with something else, a faint, acrid scent, almost metallic, that made my stomach churn. The walls of the crypt were covered in strange symbols, runes carved into the stone, their meaning lost to time. There were two large sarcophagi at the center of the crypt, their lids cracked open, revealing nothing but darkness within. A cold draft blew through the room, sending shivers down my spine. I flashed my light around, taking in the eerie surroundings. There was nothing in the crypt except for the two sarcophagi and a large stone altar in the center, upon which lay a broken and weathered book. It looked ancient, its pages yellowed with age and the leather binding frayed. I couldn't help but feel drawn to it, as if something inside it was calling to me. "Hey, check this out," I said, lifting the book carefully. It was surprisingly heavy, and as I flipped it open, I was met with pages written in a language I didn't recognize. It wasn't Latin or any language I had studied, but the writing looked old, even older than the crypt itself. As I turned the pages, I noticed a drawing, a sketch of the crypt we were standing in, but there was something wrong about it. In the drawing, the crypt wasn't empty. It showed figures standing in front of the altar, figures that looked human, but not quite. I couldn't explain why, but the longer I stared at the drawing, the more I felt a sense of dread. The air around me grew colder, and the shadows in the crypt seemed to grow longer. I looked up at Adam, who was examining one of the sarcophagi, and tried to shake off the feeling of unease. "Let's get out of here," I said, my voice a little shaky. "This place is giving me the creeps." Adam, however, was too intrigued to leave. "Come on, just a little longer. I want to see what's inside these." I hesitated, but curiosity once again got the better of me. Together, we moved toward the sarcophagus Adam was inspecting. As we got closer, the temperature seemed to drop even further, the cold seeping into our bones. I watched as Adam pushed against the lid of the sarcophagus, trying to move it. There was a low, grinding noise as it shifted slightly, but then it stopped. Suddenly, the air seemed to hum with energy, and I could hear something. Soft whispers, like voices coming from the walls of the crypt. I turned to look, but there was no one else in the room. The whispers grew louder, more urgent, as if trying to warn us. My heart raced as I backed away from the sarcophagus. "Adam, stop," I whispered, my voice tight with fear. But he didn't hear me. His hands were still on the lid, pushing harder now. Then, the lid cracked open with a loud noise, sending a burst of air into the room. A black, foul-smelling mist poured out from inside the sarcophagus, filling the crypt with an unbearable stench. I gasped, stumbling back, but the mist seemed to cling to me, swirling around my feet, as if it were alive. The whispers grew louder, now a chorus of voices all around us. And then I saw it, a figure, emerging from the darkness of the sarcophagus. At first, it was just a shadow, but as it stepped forward, I could make out its shape. A gaunt figure, draped in tattered robes, its skin as pale as death, its eyes hollow pits of darkness. It reached out a bony hand, and the temperature in the room dropped even further, until I could see my breath fogging in the air. "Run!" I screamed, turning toward the door, but it slammed shut in front of us with a deafening crash. We were trapped. The figure advanced, its eyes fixed on us, its mouth opening in a silent scream. I could feel the presence of something ancient and evil filling the crypt, suffocating the air. Adam was paralyzed with fear, unable to move, and I couldn't help but stare at the thing before us, unable to look away. Suddenly, the ground beneath us trembled, and the walls of the crypt seemed to shift. The symbols on the walls began to glow with an eerie light, and the figure in front of us began to chant in a language I couldn't understand. The whispers grew louder, now a deafening roar, and I felt as if my very soul was being pulled toward the figure. With every ounce of strength I had, I threw myself at the door, slamming my shoulder into it. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, with a final push, the door gave way, and I stumbled out into the rain-soaked cemetery, gasping for breath. I didn't stop running until I was back at the car, panting and shaking. Adam was right behind me, his face pale, his eyes wide with terror. Neither of us said a word as we drove away, leaving Ravenshade Cemetery behind. But the whispers never left me. Even now, years later, I can still hear them in the dead of night, calling me back to the crypt. I know the spirits of the crypt are still there, waiting, and I fear they are not finished with me yet. If you ever find yourself near Ravenshade Cemetery, stay far away from the crypt. Some places are best left forgotten. Some things should never be disturbed. I had always been the curious type. Growing up in a small, quiet town like Ashford meant that excitement was hard to come by, and I often sought out thrills in the form of exploring old, abandoned places. My friends and I used to wander the woods, visit the old mill, or even explore the forgotten tunnels beneath the town. But nothing intrigued me as much as Ashford's graveyard. The graveyard had been there for centuries, and the older townsfolk often told stories about it. It wasn't just any ordinary cemetery. The tombstones were crooked, the paths overgrown, and the entire place gave off an eerie feeling that sent shivers down your spine, even during the daytime. But the real mystery was the crypt, the Ashford Crypt, located in the farthest corner of the cemetery, beyond where the main road wound and the last tombstones lay forgotten in the underbrush. I had heard rumors of people seeing figures in the graveyard at night, whispers of people who had wandered too close to the crypt and never returned. Some said that the spirits of the dead never rested there, that the crypt was cursed, a prison for souls who could never find peace. Naturally, I was skeptical. I wasn't one to believe in ghosts or curses. So when my friend Sarah suggested we visit the crypt one night, I agreed without hesitation. "We'll be fine," I said, trying to reassure both Sarah and myself. "We'll go, check it out, and then we'll leave. It's just an old building. Nothing to be afraid of." Sarah wasn't so sure. "You've heard the stories, though. People say it's haunted. People who go there. I'm sure they're just rumors." I cut her off, trying to hide the slight unease in my voice. It was a crisp autumn night when we made our way to the cemetery. The moon was hidden behind thick clouds, and the world seemed to be swallowed in darkness. The wind whispered through the trees, carrying with it the faintest scent of earth and decay. We arrived at the cemetery gate just after midnight, the iron bars creaking as we pushed them open. The air was thick with the scent of damp leaves and wet soil. The cemetery was silent, except for the occasional rustling of the trees and the soft crunch of our footsteps on the gravel path. The cemetery was nearly forgotten, its graves so old that the inscriptions on many were illegible, the stones half sunken into the earth. As we walked deeper into the cemetery, the darkness grew thicker around us, and the silence was broken only by the sound of our breathing. The wind had picked up, and the trees swayed ominously. It felt like the entire place was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. "I don't know about this," Sarah murmured, clutching her flashlight tightly. "It's too quiet here. I mean, look at this place." But I pressed on. "We're almost there." We finally reached the farthest corner of the cemetery, where the Ashford Crypt stood. It loomed in the distance, shrouded in shadow. The stone building seemed ancient, worn by centuries of weathering. The heavy iron door was half ajar, the hinges rusted and creaking with every gust of wind. The sight of it sent a chill down my spine. "Well, here we are," I said, my voice sounding louder than it should in the eerie silence. Sarah stopped a few feet away, hesitant to go any closer. "Maybe we should just turn back," she said, her voice trembling. "I don't like this." I could feel the unease creeping in too, but I pushed it aside. "Come on, it's just a crypt. What's the worst that could happen?" With a deep breath, I walked toward the door, pushing it open with a groan. The moment I stepped inside, the temperature dropped. It was like entering a tomb, the air thick and heavy with a musty, decayed smell. The darkness inside was suffocating, broken only by the light of our flashlights. The crypt was empty except for two stone sarcophagi at the center, their lids cracked open. The walls were adorned with strange symbols and carvings that I didn't recognize. I shone my flashlight across the stone, trying to make sense of the markings, but they only seemed to make the place feel more unsettling. "Let's just take a quick look around," I said, trying to mask the unease that was creeping up my spine. "Then we can leave." Sarah didn't respond. She was standing still, staring at the far wall of the crypt, her flashlight pointed toward it. "What's that?" she whispered. I followed her gaze and froze. At first, I thought it was just a shadow or a trick of the light, but the longer I looked, the more I realized it was something else. There, etched into the stone wall, was a strange inscription, an odd combination of symbols and letters that seemed to shimmer faintly in the light. "What is that?" I whispered, stepping closer. My heart began to race, and a cold sweat broke out across my brow. "I don't know," Sarah said, her voice trembling. "It wasn't there before, but as I looked closer, I could see something else, something even more disturbing. In the reflection of my flashlight, I saw movement in the shadows. Something, or someone, was shifting in the darkness. My breath caught in my throat, and I turned quickly, scanning the crypt. Nothing. But then I heard it, a low, guttural whisper, like a voice calling out from the walls of the crypt. I couldn't make out the words, but the sound sent an icy shiver through me. It was coming from everywhere. Above me, behind me, all around me. "Did you hear that?" I gasped, my voice barely above a whisper. Sarah nodded, wide-eyed. "We need to get out of here. Now." But before we could move, the air seemed to thicken, and the ground beneath our feet trembled. The crypt seemed to come alive. The symbols on the walls began to glow faintly, casting a sickly green light across the room. The temperature dropped even further, and I could see my breath forming in the air. I tried to move toward the door, but it wouldn't budge. The iron door, which had once creaked open so easily, was now completely stuck. It was as if something, or someone, was holding it shut from the other side. "Help!" I shouted, pushing against the door with all my strength, but it wouldn't move. Panic set in. The crypt felt like it was closing in on me, the walls pressing in as though the very earth beneath us was swallowing us whole. Suddenly, I felt something brush against my ankle, like a cold, clammy hand reaching out from the floor. I looked down, but there was nothing there. Then, without warning, a low, echoing laugh filled the room, reverberating through the crypt. It was deep, guttural, and it made my blood run cold. "We have disturbed the resting place of the dead," a voice whispered, so faint that I could barely hear it. "You should not have come here." My heart pounded in my chest as I turned, desperately searching for a way out. But then I saw it. Figures emerging from the shadows, their forms indistinct, their faces twisted in agony. They drifted toward us, floating above the ground, their eyes hollow and lifeless. "Please, help us," one of the figures whispered. It was a woman, her face pale and gaunt, her hair matted with what looked like blood. "You must leave before it is too late." I grabbed Sarah's hand, pulling her toward the door, but it was no use. The figures closed in on us, their whispers growing louder and more frantic. I could feel the coldness of their presence, as though their spirits were pressing in on us, trapping us in the crypt. "Leave. Now," the woman cried. And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, the door of the crypt burst open with a deafening crash. We didn't hesitate. We bolted, running as fast as we could, not daring to look back. We didn't stop until we were out of the cemetery, gasping for breath and drenched in sweat. The moment we stepped outside the gate, the air seemed to return to normal. The coldness lifted, and the oppressive weight that had been pressing down on us disappeared. But as we looked back toward the cemetery, we saw something that froze us in our tracks. In the distance, standing at the edge of the crypt, was a shadowy figure, its eyes glowing faintly in the dark. It was watching us. We didn't speak as we made our way back to the car. Neither of us wanted to acknowledge what had just happened, but we both knew one thing for sure. There was something in that crypt, something that didn't want to be disturbed. We never spoke about the hollow graveyard again, but sometimes, When the wind howls through the trees, or when the night is particularly still, I can hear the whispers calling from the crypt, and I wonder if the spirits of Ashford are still waiting for someone to unlock their prison. I had heard about Hollow Hill Cemetery for years, but I never gave it much thought. The cemetery sat on the outskirts of town, hidden away behind thick trees and a tall stone wall, its entrance always gated and locked. People spoke of it in hushed tones, as if it was cursed, a place where the dead were restless. The older folks in town said that anyone who dared to enter at night would hear voices whispering from the grave, or worse, be touched by the cold, skeletal hands of those who were buried there. I always brushed it off as folklore, a bit of local superstition, but that was before I had my encounter. It was late one fall evening when my curiosity finally got the better of me. I had spent weeks hearing my friends talk about exploring the cemetery, daring each other to go in, but I had always hesitated. That night, however, was different. The air was thick with fog, and the moon hung low in the sky, casting an eerie glow over the town. It felt like the perfect night to finally see what all the fuss was about. "Are you in, or what?" my friend, Jake, asked over the phone. He was always the one pushing us to do stupid things, and for some reason, I found myself agreeing. We had gathered a small group of friends, Jake, Emma, and Tyler, and we were all meeting at the cemetery gate around midnight. I had never really believed in ghosts, but the idea of sneaking into Hollow Hill Cemetery at night was too tempting to resist. We met at the iron gates that surrounded the cemetery. The wind had picked up, rustling the dead leaves that had gathered at the base of the wall. The place felt abandoned, forgotten by time, with only the faintest hint of a path leading through the overgrown bushes and trees. The air was damp, and the smell of wet earth hung heavily in the air. I had to admit, there was something unnerving about the place. It felt wrong, like we weren't supposed to be there. Jake was already at the gate, trying to pry it open. He grinned when he saw us approach. "This is it. Time to see what's inside." The gate creaked as Jake pulled it open, and we stepped inside. The cemetery was even more unsettling than I had imagined. The tombstones were old, some so weathered that the inscriptions had long since faded away. Others were cracked or leaning at odd angles. There was a heavy silence in the air, broken only by the occasional rustle of branches in the wind. The fog seemed to swirl around us, swallowing everything in its path. Tyler pulled out his flashlight, and we all flicked ours on. "Let's stick together," he said, his voice a little shaky. I could tell he was nervous, but trying to act tough for the rest of us. We walked slowly along the worn path, our footsteps crunching on the gravel. The trees on either side seemed to close in on us, their twisted branches stretching out like skeletal fingers. Every few steps, we passed more graves, some simple, some elaborate, but all forgotten in the shadows. The place felt ancient, and it was easy to imagine that something, or someone, had been watching us for far longer than we'd been there. "So, where's the crypt?" Emma asked, her voice breaking the silence. I had heard rumors about a crypt in the cemetery, a large stone structure hidden away in the far corner. The stories said that the crypt was where the most powerful spirits of the cemetery resided, where the restless souls of the dead gathered to torment anyone who dared enter. We all paused, looking at each other. "It's supposed to be back this way," Jake said, turning toward a path that veered off from the main road. We followed him, each of us feeling the weight of the place settle deeper into our bones. The fog seemed to grow thicker as we moved deeper into the cemetery, and the temperature dropped noticeably. I could see my breath in the cold air. The further we walked, the darker it became. Our flashlights barely pierced the blackness ahead of us. It felt like we were being drawn in, like the cemetery itself was alive, pulling us toward something. Finally, after what felt like an eternity of walking, we came to the far corner of the cemetery. There, half hidden by the creeping ivy and overgrown bushes, stood the crypt. It was larger than I had expected, made of dark stone, its surface cracked and worn by the passage of time. The heavy iron door was slightly ajar, as if inviting us in. "Here it is," Jake said, his voice barely a whisper. "Let's go inside." None of us said anything, but I could tell we were all hesitant. The crypt loomed before us like some ancient, forgotten tomb, its cold stone walls exuding an air of death and decay. We stood there for a moment, the only sound the wind rustling through the trees. I had no idea why, but something felt wrong. Every instinct in my body screamed at me to turn around and leave, but I couldn't bring myself to do it. The others seemed to feel it too, but they didn't say anything. Finally, after a long silence, Jake pushed the door open with a creak, and we stepped inside. The air inside was thick, heavy with the smell of dust and mildew. The temperature was even colder than it had been outside, and I could feel the chill seeping through my bones. The walls were lined with shelves and stone niches, most of them empty, though some still held the remnants of old, decayed coffins. There were cobwebs everywhere, and the faintest hint of something else, a kind of energy that hummed in the air, making my skin prickle. "Whoa," Emma whispered, her flashlight shaking as she scanned the room. "This place it's like it's been untouched for years." Jake stepped forward, shining his light around. "Let's just look around and get out of here. I don't want to stay too long." We walked further into the crypt, each of us nervous but too curious to leave. As we reached the back, we saw something that made us all freeze. In the farthest corner of the crypt was a large stone sarcophagus, covered in moss and dust. It was unlike anything I had ever seen before. Elaborate carvings of strange symbols were etched into the stone, and there was a plaque on top that read, "The Keeper of Souls." Tyler took a step closer, his flashlight illuminating the plaque. "What does that mean?" he muttered. Before any of us could respond, there was a loud, echoing sound, a scraping noise like something dragging across stone. We froze, our hearts racing in our chests. The sound came again, this time louder, closer, and then, as if in response, a low, guttural growl echoed from the far end of the crypt. We turned toward the sound, but there was nothing there, just shadows, deep and impenetrable. "I think we need to go," I said, my voice shaking, but it was too late. The temperature in the crypt dropped even further, and the walls seemed to pulse, as if something beneath the stone was awakening. The growl grew louder, more distinct, now accompanied by a low hiss. A shadow seemed to move in the corner of my eye, and I turned just in time to see someone, standing by the sarcophagus. A figure, tall and thin, wrapped in tattered robes, its face obscured by shadows. "We should have never come here," the figure whispered, its voice soft but filled with a terrible menace. Panic hit me like a wave. "Run!" I screamed. We turned and bolted toward the door, but the crypt seemed to stretch before us, the walls narrowing in, the door impossibly far away. The shadows in the corners seemed to come alive, reaching for us with skeletal hands, their fingers grazing our skin as we ran. The growl became a roar, and the figure stepped forward, blocking our way. "You disturbed the keeper," it hissed. "Now you belong to him." With no other choice, we sprinted toward the back of the crypt, hoping to find another way out. But every turn seemed to lead to another dead end. The walls seemed to close in, suffocating us, and the air grew so thick with an otherworldly presence that it felt like it was crushing our lungs. Finally, I found a narrow crack in the back wall. It was barely big enough for one person to slip through, but I didn't care. I shoved through first, feeling the cold stone scrape against my skin, and emerged on the other side, gasping for air. The others followed quickly, and we didn't stop running until we were far from the cemetery. As we made our way back to town, I glanced over my shoulder. The cemetery was still there, silent and dark, but I could feel it watching us. The Keeper of Souls had been awakened, and I knew that our lives would never be the same. None of us spoke about that night again, but every time I pass the cemetery, I feel that same chill crawl up my spine. Something still lingers there, in the dark corners of Hollow Hill Cemetery, waiting for the next unwitting soul to disturb its peace. There are places in this world where the veil between the living and the dead is thin, and Blackwood Cemetery is one of them. I grew up in a small town, not far from Blackwood, and I've always been drawn to stories, especially the dark ones. The town's history was dotted with tales of mysterious deaths, strange happenings, and one place in particular that haunted my childhood, Blackwood Cemetery. I first heard about it when I was just a kid. My father would always warn me to stay away from there, saying it was a place where restless souls roamed at night, looking for a way to escape. The cemetery itself wasn't much to look at during the day. The gravestones were old, some barely standing, and the pathways were overgrown with weeds. But it was the crypts that had the most stories attached to them. There was one crypt in particular, an ancient stone structure hidden in the far corner of the cemetery that was said to be cursed. The stories told of an old family, the Blackwoods, who had lived in the town centuries ago. They were rumored to have practiced dark magic, and when they died, they were buried together in that crypt. Locals said the crypt was locked, sealed with a curse so powerful that anyone who dared to open it would unleash an evil so great that it would consume the entire town. As I grew older, the stories became more fascinating than terrifying. The mystery of the Blackwood family, the whispers of forbidden rituals, and the crypt that seemed to call out to those who dared approach. I couldn't resist. One summer evening, I decided I would go to Blackwood Cemetery to see the crypt for myself. I didn't believe in the supernatural. I was a skeptic, but something about that place intrigued me. Maybe I could prove all the ghost stories wrong. I gathered a few of my friends, Will, Mark, and Sarah, and convinced them to join me. None of them were particularly thrilled about the idea, but curiosity won out. We met at the edge of the cemetery just after sunset, the darkening sky casting long shadows over the graves. The cemetery gate was old, the iron bars rusted and creaking as we pushed them open. A faint breeze stirred the leaves, and the air felt heavy, like the earth itself was holding its breath. The ground was soft beneath our feet, and the smell of damp soil hung in the air. The graveyard seemed deserted, as if no one had visited for decades. The only sound was the occasional rustling of branches and the distant hoot of an owl. "Let's stick to the main path," I said, leading the way. I wasn't sure what I was looking for, but I had to see the crypt with my own eyes. As we walked deeper into the cemetery, the air grew colder. The trees loomed over us like silent sentinels, their twisted branches reaching for the sky. I noticed that the gravestones here were older than those near the entrance. Some were cracked, others completely unreadable. A chill ran down my spine. I tried to shake off the feeling, telling myself it was just the atmosphere of the place. After what felt like an eternity of walking, we reached the farthest corner of the cemetery. There, half hidden by vines and overgrowth, stood the crypt. It was massive, made of dark stone, and looked as though it had been standing there for centuries. The door was solid, iron-bound, and sealed shut. Above it, an inscription was carved into the stone, but the letters were so faded that I couldn't make them out. A strange sense of unease crept over me, and I felt an almost magnetic pull toward it. "This is it," I whispered, my voice barely audible. The Blackwood crypt. We all stood there for a moment, just staring at it. Even though I didn't believe in ghosts, the air felt unnaturally still, and the crypt seemed to watch us, its presence unsettling. It felt like the place was holding its breath, waiting for something. "Well," Mark said, breaking the silence, "are we just going to stand here, or are we going inside?" Will and Sarah exchanged uneasy glances, but I could tell they were just as curious as I was. "We should take a look inside," I said, trying to sound confident. "We're not going to get another chance." I pushed against the iron door, and to my surprise, it creaked open. It was almost as if the crypt was inviting us in. The air inside was colder than outside, and it smelled damp, like mildew and decay. We stepped inside, our flashlights illuminating the darkness. The crypt was filled with rows of stone tombs, stacked one on top of the other. The air felt heavy, and every step we took seemed to echo through the vast space. "Do you feel that?" Sarah whispered, her voice trembling. "It's like the air is different." I nodded, but I wasn't sure what to make of it. The place felt ancient, as if it had been untouched by time. As we moved deeper into the crypt, I noticed something strange. The walls were lined with strange symbols, carved into the stone in a language I didn't recognize. They seemed to glow faintly in the beam of my flashlight, casting eerie shadows across the crypt. "Look at this," Will said, pointing to a large stone slab in the center of the room. It was covered in dust, but the markings on it were still visible. A set of runes, arranged in a perfect circle. "What is this?" I asked, kneeling beside it. "I don't know," Will said, frowning, "but it looks like some kind of ritual." Suddenly, we heard a noise, faint but unmistakable, a low, grinding sound, like stone shifting against stone. We froze, our hearts pounding in our chests. The sound grew louder, and then, out of nowhere, the ground beneath our feet trembled. "Did you hear that?" Sarah gasped, her voice barely audible. Before anyone could answer, the door to the crypt slammed shut behind us with a deafening crash. We all jumped, panic setting in. I rushed to the door, pulling on the iron handle, but it was locked. The door wouldn't budge. "Is it locked?" Mark asked, his voice shaking. "Yes," I replied, my stomach sinking. "We're trapped." The crypt seemed to close in around us. The temperature dropped even further, and I could see my breath forming in the air. The faint glow from the symbols on the walls grew brighter, and the runes on the stone slab seemed to pulse with an unnatural energy. "What's happening?" Will asked, his voice filled with terror. Before anyone could answer, a low, guttural growl echoed through the crypt. It wasn't coming from any of us. It was coming from the tombs. The ground beneath us began to tremble again, and the walls seemed to shift. The shadows in the corners of the crypt began to writhe, as if they were alive. "We have to get out of here," I shouted, my voice rising in panic. We ran toward the door, but before we could reach it, a figure appeared in the center of the room. It was tall, its face hidden beneath a dark hood, and it seemed to float above the ground. It was surrounded by an aura of cold, and as it moved toward us, the temperature dropped even further. "No one leaves," the figure said in a voice that sent chills down my spine. It was deep, echoing, and filled with an otherworldly power. We backed away, horrified. The figure raised one hand, and the crypt trembled again. The ground cracked open beneath us, revealing a pit of blackness that seemed to stretch on forever. "You've disturbed the resting place of the Blackwoods," the figure continued, its voice growing louder. "Now you will join them." Suddenly, the stone tombs around us began to shift. The lids creaked open, and dark, shadowy figures began to rise from within. The air was filled with a terrible, grinding noise, and the floor beneath us seemed to buckle. I grabbed Sarah's arm, pulling her toward the back of the crypt. "We have to find another way out," I screamed. We ran in the opposite direction, toward a narrow passage that led deeper into the crypt. The air grew colder, and the shadows seemed to press in on us. We stumbled through the dark corridor, desperate to escape the nightmare that was unfolding. After what felt like hours, we finally reached a small, hidden door at the back of the crypt. I tried the handle. It turned. With a rush of relief, we pushed it open and spilled out into the night air. We didn't look back as we ran, not stopping until we were back at the entrance to Blackwood Cemetery. The door to the crypt slammed shut behind us, and the sounds of the growling, the figures, and the strange voice faded away. We never spoke of that night again, but every now and then, I think about the Blackwood crypt and the curse that still lingers beneath Blackwood Cemetery. I don't know what happened that night, but I know one thing for sure. The Blackwoods are still waiting, and the crypt is still calling for those who dare enter. It was a cool autumn evening when I first heard the story of Ravensbrook Cemetery. I was visiting my grandmother in a small town nestled between dense woods, far away from the bustling city life. The town was old, founded in the 1700s, and with age came its fair share of secrets. I had grown up hearing ghost stories from my grandmother, who was always eager to share the eerie tales of the town. But there was one story, one graveyard, that seemed to unsettle her more than any other. Ravensbrook Cemetery. Grandma never liked to talk about it. If I asked her, she would change the subject quickly, but one evening, she finally told me the truth. "Never go near Ravensbrook," she said, her voice low and almost whispering. "There's something wrong with that place." At first, I didn't understand why she was so afraid. It was just a cemetery, right? They were all the same, weren't they? But as I listened to her stories, I realized that Ravensbrook was different. Ravensbrook Cemetery was hidden away on the edge of the woods, surrounded by an old, rusted iron fence. It was known for its old graves, some of them dating back hundreds of years, and the peculiar tombstones that seemed to twist and contort in strange patterns. But what made Ravensbrook truly terrifying was the legend of the Forgotten Vault. The vault was said to be a hidden crypt beneath the cemetery, a place where the most powerful and dangerous souls were buried. According to local lore, the crypt had been sealed for centuries, but it was rumored that on certain nights, when the moon was high and the wind howled through the trees, the vault would begin to awaken. Those who dared enter would never return, their souls lost to the darkness within. Of course, I didn't believe in such things. But even so, the story lingered in the back of my mind as I visited the cemetery the next day. I went alone. The cemetery was only a short walk from my grandmother's house, and I figured it was just a regular, if slightly eerie place. As I walked through the gate, I was immediately struck by the unsettling silence. It was so still. No birds, no rustling of leaves. The trees stood like silent sentinels, their twisted branches blocking out most of the sunlight. The gravestones were old, cracked, and covered in ivy, and some were so worn that the names on them had become illegible. I walked further into the cemetery, looking around. There was a strange sense of isolation, like I was the only person in the world. The air was thick with the scent of damp earth and decay. The deeper I went, the more I felt the weight of the place pressing down on me, as if the very ground beneath my feet held a dark secret. I made my way toward the farthest corner of the cemetery, where the trees grew thick and close. This was where the vault was said to be hidden, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me. I hesitated at the edge of the trees, but curiosity got the best of me. There, almost completely concealed by overgrown vines and moss, I found an old stone structure. It was not a typical tomb. It was larger, much more imposing. The stones that made up the walls were old and weathered, and the entrance was sealed by a massive iron door, rusted and covered in strange symbols. I stood there for a moment, my heart racing. This was it, the Forgotten Vault. My mind raced with the stories my grandmother had told me. According to her, the vault was a place of unimaginable evil, a prison for the most dangerous souls who had ever lived. The vault had been sealed by the original settlers of the town, but over time, it had been forgotten, left to rot in the shadows of Ravensbrook Cemetery. I reached out to touch the rusted door, and to my surprise, it creaked open slightly, just enough for me to slip through. My heart pounded in my chest as I stepped into the darkness beyond. The air inside was stale and heavy, the smell of old stone and earth overwhelming. My flashlight flickered as I swept it around the chamber. What I saw took my breath away. The vault was massive, its stone walls lined with shelves of dusty old books and forgotten relics. The floor was covered in broken stone tiles, and the room was filled with a thick, unnatural fog that clung to the ground like a blanket. There were dozens of alcoves carved into the walls, each one holding a stone sarcophagus. Some of the sarcophagi were cracked, others completely untouched, but each one was engraved with symbols that seemed to shimmer in the dim light. Suddenly, I felt it, a chill, a coldness that ran down my spine. I wasn't alone. I turned, and there, in the far corner of the room, was a figure standing in the shadows. I couldn't see its face, but I could feel its presence, as though it was watching me. I stood frozen, my breath caught in my throat. My mind raced with fear, and every instinct told me to run. But I couldn't move. The figure stepped closer, and I saw a faint glow coming from its eyes. It was tall, too tall, and its limbs were long and thin, like they didn't belong to a human. It was covered in tattered robes that seemed to shift and move on their own, as if they were alive. "You shouldn't have come," the figure said in a voice that sounded like it came from the depths of the earth. Its voice echoed in the chamber, and the walls seemed to tremble in response. I took a step back, but my feet wouldn't move. The figure took another step toward me, its presence growing stronger, more suffocating. "Leave now, or you will become one of us," it hissed, its voice full of malice. I wanted to run. I wanted to scream, to flee from the nightmare I had walked into, but my body wouldn't obey. I was trapped in the vault, with nowhere to go. As I stood there, paralyzed with fear, I noticed something else. The alcoves around me were moving. The stone lids of the sarcophagi were shifting, slowly at first, but then faster, as if they were being forced open from within. I heard the sound of scraping stone, and then, groaning, low and terrible, a figure rose from one of the sarcophagi. It was a man, or at least it had once been. His skin was pale and decayed, his eyes hollow pits of darkness. He wore a tattered cloak, and his hands were long and bony, covered in dark stains. As he stood, the other sarcophagi began to open, and more figures emerged from their resting places. The figure in front of me laughed, a sound like the scraping of metal on stone. "You've awoken them," it whispered, as the other figures gathered around me. "Now you belong to us." I was surrounded by the dead, trapped in a crypt with no way out. The figures moved closer, their cold hands reaching for me. I could feel their breath on my skin, cold as death. The air grew thick with a dark energy, and the fog seemed to grow heavier, wrapping around my legs and arms. In that moment, I thought I was done for. There was no escape. The vault, with its evil inhabitants, would claim me just like the others who had ventured here before. But then, as suddenly as it had begun, the figure in front of me stopped. It looked toward the entrance of the crypt, its head tilting as if listening for something. "No," it whispered, its voice filled with anger. "It's not time." With a swift motion, the figures froze, their hands retracting, and the fog cleared. The presence that had been suffocating me lifted, and I could breathe again. I looked around, dazed and confused, as the crypt returned to its deathly stillness. The figure that had spoken to me turned toward the shadows. Its glowing eyes narrowed, and for a moment, I thought it was going to speak again. But then, without warning, it retreated into the darkness, followed by the other figures. The sarcophagi slid back into place, and the room fell silent once more. I don't know how long I stood there, frozen in place, too terrified to move. The figures were gone, the crypt was quiet, and the door to the vault was still ajar. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, I gathered the strength to turn and run. I didn't look back as I sprinted through the dark corridors of the crypt and out into the cemetery. When I reached the entrance of Ravensbrook, the moon was high in the sky, casting long shadows over the graves. I felt the weight of what I had just experienced bearing down on me. I never told anyone about what happened in the Forgotten Vault, not even my grandmother. To this day, I wonder if I truly escaped the crypt, or if part of me was left behind, locked away with the others who had awakened the curse of Ravensbrook Cemetery. One thing I know for certain is this: the vault is still there, beneath the cemetery, waiting. And if you're ever foolish enough to wander too close, you might hear the whispers of the dead, calling you to join them. Rosewood Cemetery, nestled at the edge of a quiet town, was a place that everyone knew about, but no one dared to visit. The local people always referred to it as the Wailing Tomb when they spoke about it, and whenever anyone mentioned the cemetery, an uneasy silence would fall over the conversation. As a child, I always wondered why it was so feared. My grandmother often told me stories of the place, and though I never believed in ghosts or curses, I couldn't help but feel a chill run down my spine whenever she mentioned the Wailing Tomb. The cemetery itself wasn't very large, though it seemed to stretch endlessly in some directions. Its paths were overgrown with weeds and ivy, and the tombstones, most of which were cracked and tilted, stood in rows like forgotten sentinels. The trees surrounding the place grew in a twisted, gnarled fashion, their branches reaching out like skeletal hands that seemed to grasp at the sky. On quiet days, if the wind was just right, you could hear a faint wailing sound coming from the deepest part of the cemetery, and that was the source of all the rumors. I didn't think much of the stories. As a teenager, I found them to be nothing more than spooky tales designed to keep kids away from the graveyard. The Wailing Tomb, they said, was the resting place of a young woman named Evelyn Rose, who had been buried alive over a century ago after a terrible mistake. Some even claimed she was cursed, doomed to wander the cemetery for eternity, wailing for her lost life. I had spent years hearing about this curse, and as far as I was concerned, it was just that, a story. One summer evening, when I was 16, I decided to prove to myself once and for all that there was nothing supernatural about Rosewood Cemetery. armed with only my flashlight and the bravado of a teenager eager to prove his courage. I set off alone toward the cemetery at dusk. The air was thick with the scent of earth and decay as I passed through the rusted iron gates. The cemetery was eerily quiet, save for the rustling of leaves in the wind. The sound was oddly comforting to me, as though nature itself was trying to reassure me that there was nothing to fear. I walked along the main path, noting the way the gravestones seemed to lean away from the path as if they were trying to avoid being seen. The deeper I walked into the cemetery, the darker it became. The trees grew denser, casting long shadows that seemed to flicker in the dimming light. I could hear my footsteps crunching on the gravel, and the sound of my own breathing became louder in my ears. There was no wind now, and no birds, only the silence that surrounded me. As I reached the farthest corner of the cemetery, I saw it, the Wailing Tomb. The tomb was different from the others. It was a large, imposing structure made of dark stone, its surface covered in moss and creeping vines. At the top of the tomb, there was a faded inscription that had become nearly unreadable over the years. However, there was one thing I couldn't ignore: the faint wailing that seemed to rise from the tomb itself. It was low at first, like the sound of someone crying, but then it grew louder, more distinct, and more desperate. I stopped in my tracks, my heart pounding. The air around me seemed to grow colder, and a chill ran down my spine. My flashlight flickered, and I quickly checked the batteries, but there was nothing wrong. I could still hear the wailing, and it was coming from the tomb. "All right, let's see what's going on," I muttered to myself, trying to push down the knot of fear that was tightening in my chest. The tomb was sealed tight, but I could see that there was a small gap in the stone where the door had once been. I knelt down and peered inside, my flashlight revealing the interior. The tomb appeared to be empty, the stone floor smooth and untouched by time, save for the dust and cobwebs that clung to every surface. The wailing grew louder still, and I could feel it vibrating through the ground beneath my feet. It was no longer a faint cry. It was a full, heart-wrenching wail of someone in agony. I stood up quickly, backing away from the tomb, my mind racing. The stories had said that Evelyn Rose's spirit had never left the cemetery, but I had always thought they were just stories. Suddenly, I heard something shift inside the tomb, a scraping sound, like nails against stone. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. Then, the wailing stopped, replaced by a soft, raspy whisper, almost too faint to hear. "Help me." The voice sounded broken, pleading, and filled with sorrow. My blood ran cold, and for the first time in my life, I felt the real terror of the stories. The wailing, the whispering. It wasn't just the wind. It was something else, something far darker. I stepped back slowly, my flashlight trembling in my hand. But just as I turned to leave, a sudden gust of wind whipped through the cemetery, causing the trees to shake and the gravestones to rattle. I heard the whisper again, but this time, it was louder, sharper. "Help me, or you will join me." I spun around, my heart racing. For a brief moment, I thought I saw something move in the shadows near the tomb, but when I shined my light there, the space was empty. Still, the coldness in the air remained, pressing in on me. I needed to get out of there. Fast. I started to back away, but before I could turn, I felt something brush against my leg. I looked down and saw a pale, skeletal hand emerging from the ground. It gripped my ankle with an unnatural strength, pulling me toward the tomb. I gasped, stumbling backward as the hand tightened its grip. The ground beneath me felt soft, like it was swallowing me whole. I kicked and struggled, managing to break free from the grip, but as I stood up, I felt an overwhelming pressure on my chest, like something heavy was sitting on me. The wailing returned, louder than ever, filling my ears and making it hard to think. I glanced around, frantic, but the shadows seemed to close in on me, and the tomb loomed just ahead, as if it was alive, waiting to claim me. I didn't look back again. I ran. The cemetery seemed to stretch on forever as I sprinted through the rows of graves, my breath coming in ragged gasps. The wailing followed me, echoing through the darkness, growing fainter as I neared the gates. I could barely see through the darkness, but I didn't care. I had to get out. I had to escape. Finally, I reached the gate, my hands shaking as I pulled it open. I didn't stop running until I was back at my grandmother's house, out of breath and covered in sweat. I collapsed on the porch, my body trembling uncontrollably. I never went back to Rosewood Cemetery after that night. I couldn't. The image of that skeletal hand, reaching up from the earth, haunted me for weeks. And the wailing, it still echoes in my mind, especially when the wind blows through the trees at night. They say Evelyn Rose's curse still lingers in the cemetery, that her spirit roams the grounds, wailing for help that will never come. Some claim that if you listen closely enough, you can still hear her cry for help, faintly drifting through the trees. I don't know if the stories are true. All I know is that I'll never go near the Wailing Tomb again. No one should ever have to hear that cry for help. The town of Brookside had always been a quiet place, a small, picturesque village surrounded by thick woods and rolling hills. People knew each other's names, and everyone took pride in the town's history, which stretched back more than 3 centuries. But beneath its charming exterior, there was an ancient secret that no one spoke of, not to the newcomers, not to the children, and certainly not to the tourists who passed through. It was a secret that had been buried for generations, one that kept people away from a certain place, Hollow Hill. I'd heard whispers of Hollow Hill my entire life. It was just a short distance outside of the town, a place marked by a crumbling stone church and a cemetery that stretched across the hill, its gravestones worn and leaning in odd directions. I remember walking past it as a child, feeling the hairs on the back of my neck rise, my steps quickening as I passed the gate. My grandmother often warned me not to get too close, and there was always a nervous edge to her voice when she spoke of the hill. "That place isn't safe, dear. Some things were meant to stay buried," she would say. I never really understood what she meant. It wasn't until I turned 17 and an unexplainable curiosity took root in me that I decided to explore the hill for myself. There had to be more to the stories, I thought. They were just that, stories. What could be so terrifying about an old cemetery? I gathered a flashlight, a map of the town, and a sense of youthful defiance, and set off one evening as the sun was beginning to dip behind the trees. The sky was painted in shades of purple and gold, and the air was thick with the scent of autumn. My heart beat faster as I walked along the winding dirt road that led to Hollow Hill. My grandmother's warnings echoed in my mind, but I pushed them away, determined to uncover whatever mystery lay hidden there. As I reached the entrance to the cemetery, I was struck by how ancient it looked. The wrought iron gate stood slightly ajar, and the ground was uneven, with ivy creeping up the stone walls. A cold breeze swept through the trees, making the branches sway and creak, and I felt a sudden chill that had nothing to do with the weather. I stepped into the cemetery, the gravel path crunching beneath my feet. The tombstones were old, some leaning so far to one side that they seemed ready to collapse. There were names and dates etched into the stone, but many of them had been worn down by time. The air smelled of damp earth and decay, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. The hill loomed ahead, the church standing at its crest, shrouded in shadow. From this angle, it looked like an abandoned ruin, its stone walls cracked and stained with age, its roof caving in on itself. But there was something else there, something more sinister. I could feel it in my bones. I made my way toward the church, the path leading me deeper into the cemetery. The wind had died down, but an eerie stillness hung in the air. Every step I took felt heavier than the last, and the shadows seemed to stretch unnaturally around me. I could see the old crypt near the church's entrance, its heavy stone door cracked open, as if inviting me inside. Despite the unsettling feeling in my chest, I couldn't resist the urge to explore further. I approached the crypt slowly, my flashlight flickering as if the darkness itself was trying to swallow the light. The stone door creaked loudly as I pushed it open, the sound sending a shiver down my spine. Inside was pitch black, but I could sense the weight of the years pressing in from all sides. The air was thick and musty, and the smell of old stone and dust made my eyes water. I took a deep breath and stepped inside, the beam of my flashlight cutting through the darkness. The crypt was larger than I had expected. The walls were lined with alcoves, each one holding a large stone sarcophagus. I moved cautiously, shining my light into each alcove. Some of the sarcophagi were cracked, their lids broken open, while others remained intact, their stone surfaces untouched by time. There was a sense of stillness in the air, like the place had been abandoned for centuries, and yet there was something unsettling about it. I walked deeper into the crypt, my footsteps echoing in the silence. As I reached the farthest corner, I noticed something strange. The stone floor was disturbed, as if someone, or something, had recently been digging. The earth was dark and wet, and there was a small hole in the ground. My curiosity piqued. I knelt down and shone my flashlight into the hole. To my surprise, it wasn't empty. A small wooden box lay buried there, its edges worn and faded with age. The box was locked, but I could see that it had been opened at some point, the wood splintered and cracked. I felt a chill run through me as I touched the box. There was something inside, something that made my skin crawl. Without thinking, I reached for the box and pulled it free from the earth. As I held it in my hands, I felt the weight of it, a heaviness that seemed to go beyond its size. It was as though the box contained something far older and darker than I could comprehend. I hesitated for only a moment before I pried it open, the sound of the lid creaking as I did. Inside was a small, ornate dagger. The handle was made of bone, and the blade was unlike anything I had ever seen. Blackened and stained, with strange symbols etched along its length. A cold sweat broke out on my forehead as I stared at the dagger. It felt wrong, like it shouldn't be touched. And then I heard it, a soft whisper, almost inaudible, but unmistakably there. It came from deep within the crypt, from the shadows beyond where my flashlight's beam could reach. My breath caught in my throat as the whisper grew louder, more distinct. "Put it down." I froze. The whisper wasn't just a sound. It was a command. My fingers trembled as I slowly set the dagger back into the box, my mind racing. I could feel something in the air around me, something ancient and malevolent. The darkness seemed to deepen, pressing in from all sides, suffocating me. I turned to leave, but the moment I moved, the door to the crypt slammed shut with a deafening bang. My heart raced as I scrambled to open it, but the stone was too heavy. I was trapped. Panic set in as the temperature in the crypt dropped, the air growing impossibly cold. The whispering voice grew louder, more insistent, echoing around me. "Leave, or be claimed." Suddenly, the stone walls around me began to shift. I could hear the scraping sound of stone against stone, and before I knew it, the floor beneath my feet began to crack open. The ground seemed to split in all directions, revealing a vast cavern beneath the crypt. I could hear faint sounds, scraping, wailing, coming from the depths below. I tried to run, but the air was thick, suffocating. My legs felt like they were made of lead, and each step was harder than the last. I was being pulled toward the opening, toward the cavern below, and I couldn't stop it. Then, in the distance, I saw something. A figure, shrouded in darkness. It moved toward me, its form barely visible in the shadows. The whispering voice came again, now louder and clearer. "Your soul is mine." I didn't wait to see more. In a desperate panic, I made one final attempt to push open the crypt door. It resisted at first, but with one final push, I managed to force it open. The cold air rushed into the crypt, and the whispers stopped. I didn't look back as I ran, my feet barely touching the ground. My heart pounded in my chest as I sprinted through the cemetery, past the broken gravestones, and out into the woods. I didn't stop until I reached my house, where I collapsed in the front yard, gasping for breath. The next day, I returned to Hollow Hill with the sheriff. We searched the crypt together, but we found nothing. No box, no dagger, no signs of anything strange. It was as if everything I had experienced had been erased, wiped away by time and the earth itself. But I know what I saw. I know what I felt. And as I sit here writing this, the chilling truth remains in my mind. Some places are cursed, and Hollow Hill is one of them. The crypt beneath it holds secrets that should never be uncovered, and the evil that lies beneath is not easily escaped. I never went back to the hill, and I never will. Some doors, once opened, should remain closed forever. There are places where the air feels heavier, as though the ground itself is holding its breath. I've always been fascinated by old cemeteries, with their faded stones and forgotten histories. The one place I never wanted to go, however, was Glenmore Cemetery. It wasn't the size or the location that made it so unsettling. It was the stories. Everyone in my town had heard them, and even though I considered myself a skeptic, the tales of the whispering tombstone always sent a chill down my spine. Glenmore Cemetery was nestled at the edge of town, surrounded by thick trees that seemed to close in on the area, casting long shadows over the gravestones. Its rows of old tombstones leaned at odd angles, and the ground was cracked in places where the soil had sunken. The cemetery wasn't often visited, except by the occasional mourner or curious tourist, but it was always quiet, too quiet. And at night, they say you can hear the whispers. When I was younger, I would hear the adults in town whispering about it in hushed voices. They'd say that at midnight, the whispering tombstone could be heard speaking to those brave, or foolish, enough to wander too close. The legend claimed that the stone marked the grave of a man named Samuel Gray, who had been buried there more than a century ago. Samuel had died under mysterious circumstances, and some claimed he was cursed, while others believed he had made a pact with something dark. Whatever the truth, it was said that his spirit never found peace, and his whispers could still be heard in the dead of night. As a teenager, I didn't believe in ghosts, curses, or any of that nonsense. Still, the idea of a haunted graveyard intrigued me. It became a sort of challenge for me, to prove once and for all that the stories were just that, stories. So one summer evening, after a late-night study session with friends, I decided to visit the cemetery and put my doubts to rest. It was just after midnight when I made my way to Glenmore Cemetery. The town was asleep, and the only sounds I could hear were the distant croaking of frogs and the soft rustling of leaves in the wind. The cemetery looked even more eerie under the pale light of the moon, and a sense of foreboding washed over me as I stepped through the rusted gates. At first, I didn't feel anything out of the ordinary. The stones were just stones, and the trees were just trees. But there was a coldness in the air, something that made the hairs on my neck stand up. It wasn't the temperature. It was something deeper, something unseen. I shook it off, telling myself that it was just my imagination running wild. I walked deeper into the cemetery, my flashlight cutting through the darkness. The gravel path crunched beneath my boots, and the occasional owl hooted in the distance. My heart was pounding, but I pushed forward, determined to find the whispering tombstone and get to the bottom of the legend. It didn't take long to find the stone. At the farthest corner of the cemetery, where the trees grew thickest, I saw it. The stone was tall and weathered, its surface worn by time. The name Samuel Gray was etched into the marble, barely visible under layers of grime and moss. The tombstone seemed out of place, as if it had been purposely set apart from the others. I stood there for a moment, staring at the stone, feeling an odd sense of unease. The stories flooded my mind, and I couldn't help but wonder if there was any truth to them. It wasn't just the tombstone that felt strange. It was the way the air around it felt heavier, thicker. The moonlight seemed to be swallowed by the shadow of the stone, as though the grave was pulling the light into itself. I shrugged off the feeling and bent down to examine the base of the stone. That's when I heard it. A faint whisper. At first, I thought it was just the wind, but then it came again, clearer this time. A soft, raspy voice, barely audible, as if it was coming from beneath the earth itself. "Help me." I froze, my breath catching in my throat. I looked around, my heart pounding in my chest. There was no one else around. No one in the cemetery, no one in the woods. Just me and the tombstone. The voice came again, this time louder, more desperate. "Please, help me." I took a cautious step back, my flashlight shaking in my hand. The voice wasn't coming from anywhere above ground. It seemed to be coming from the tombstone itself, from within the earth. My mind raced. Was it a trick of the wind? Was it just my nerves getting the best of me? I stood there for a moment, trying to gather my thoughts. The whispers continued, growing louder, more frantic, and I couldn't deny the feeling that someone, was trying to reach me. The wind picked up, rustling the leaves around me. I heard the faint sound of footsteps, like someone walking behind me. My heart raced as I spun around, but there was nothing there, only shadows. I turned back toward the tombstone, and that's when I saw it. The ground around the stone was shifting. It wasn't a large movement, but enough to catch my attention. The earth seemed to be moving of its own accord, as though something was pushing its way to the surface. I stumbled back, my flashlight flickering. I was paralyzed with fear, unsure whether I should run or stay. The whispering grew louder, more urgent, and then a hand. A pale, skeletal hand shot up from the ground, its fingers reaching for the air. My blood ran cold as I watched it emerge from the earth, twisting and curling as though it was alive. I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. The hand was followed by another, and then a whole arm, pulling itself up from beneath the ground. The whispers became louder, and I could now make out words, though they were unintelligible. The voice was no longer just a whisper. It was a low, guttural chant that seemed to vibrate through the ground, through my bones. I knew I should run, but I couldn't move. I was frozen in place, my legs refusing to obey. The figure began to rise from the grave, its body covered in soil and moss. Its face was pale and gaunt, with hollow eyes that seemed to look right through me. The figure was clad in tattered, decayed clothing, and its mouth moved as it continued to chant. "Samuel Gray," it whispered, its voice like 1,000 dry leaves scraping together. "I am not dead." I could feel my heart pounding in my chest as the figure slowly rose to its full height. It was as though it was trying to pull itself from the grave, desperate to be free. Its hollow eyes locked onto mine, and for a moment, I felt a cold wave of dread wash over me. I wanted to scream, to run, but I couldn't make a sound. The creature reached toward me, its skeletal fingers twitching. "Help me," it begged, its voice growing more frantic, more pleading. Something in me snapped, and I turned, sprinting away from the tombstone, not daring to look back. I could hear the whispers following me, getting louder and louder, but I didn't dare slow down. The cemetery seemed endless, and the darkness around me pressed in tighter with each step. Finally, I reached the gates, my body trembling with fear. I didn't stop until I was back in the safety of the town, my heart still racing, my mind still reeling from what I had just witnessed. I never spoke of what happened that night. I never told anyone about the whispering tombstone or the figure that rose from the grave. But I know what I saw, and to this day, I cannot pass Glenmore Cemetery without feeling the weight of the whispers following me. There are places in this world where the dead refuse to stay buried, where their voices linger in the dark corners of the earth, and sometimes they reach out, desperate for help, or perhaps for something more. The first time I heard about the Ashford Hill Cemetery was when I was just a little kid, barely 10 years old. I was staying at my aunt's house for the summer in a small town just outside of the city. There was something about the place that felt old, too old. The town, Ashford, was picturesque with its cobblestone streets and classic colonial homes, but it was always veiled in a strange sense of mystery. The locals rarely spoke about the cemetery, and when they did, their voices dropped to a hushed whisper, as if the very mention of it could summon something unwanted. I overheard one of the town's elders tell a story about the crypt on Ashford Hills one night while my aunt and I were at the local diner. My aunt, who'd lived in Ashford her whole life, just shook her head and urged me not to ask too many questions. "Some stories aren't meant to be told," she said softly, a look of unease in her eyes. Being a curious child, however, I couldn't resist. I spent the next few days sneaking around, trying to find out what made Ashford Hill so strange. It wasn't just the crypt, it was something about the whole cemetery. Some said it was haunted, others claimed it was cursed, but everyone agreed that something wasn't right. One afternoon, with the sun shining bright and the birds chirping loudly, I decided to take a walk to the cemetery. My aunt wasn't home, and I knew I had the perfect opportunity to satisfy my curiosity. I grabbed a bottle of water and set out on foot, making my way through the winding streets toward the edge of town. Ashford Hill Cemetery wasn't far from the heart of the town, nestled on a small hill overlooking the valley. The path leading up to the cemetery was long and winding, lined with overgrown trees whose twisted branches stretched across the trail like fingers. The air grew cooler as I ascended the hill, and the shadows beneath the trees deepened. When I finally reached the entrance, a heavy iron gate stood before me, rusted with age. The cemetery itself was eerie. Most of the gravestones were cracked and weathered, their inscriptions faded to the point of being unreadable. The ground seemed to sag in certain places, and there was an overwhelming sense of stillness, as though time had forgotten this place entirely. But what intrigued me the most was the crypt sitting at the far end of the cemetery, far from the other graves. It was hidden behind a dense patch of trees and thorns, and something about it made me feel like it was watching me. I slowly made my way past the gravestones, my feet crunching the dry grass beneath them. My eyes were fixed on the crypt as I approached, a sense of dread creeping into my bones. I had no idea what lay inside, but the feeling of being drawn to it was overpowering. The closer I got, the heavier the air felt, as if the weight of the crypt itself was bearing down on me. The crypt was larger than I expected. It was made of weathered stone, covered in thick ivy and moss. The door was heavy, made of iron, and stood slightly ajar, as though it had been opened and closed many times. The stone archway above it was engraved with intricate symbols, ones I didn't recognize but felt an instinctual fear toward. I stood in front of the crypt for what felt like a long time, gathering my courage. Something about the place felt alive, almost as if it had a pulse. The air was thick with an oppressive stillness, and I couldn't shake the feeling that someone, or something, was watching me from the shadows. Despite the fear gnawing at me, I pushed the door open. The interior of the crypt was dark, the only light coming from the slivers of sunlight that broke through the cracks in the walls. Inside was a large stone sarcophagus, the lid slightly askew, as if someone had disturbed it recently. The walls were adorned with more strange symbols, some of which seemed to shimmer in the low light. I stepped closer, and as I did, a chill ran through me, so cold it took my breath away. The air in the crypt was damp, and the ground beneath my feet felt wet. As I walked closer to the sarcophagus, the whispers began. At first, they were so faint I thought I might have imagined them, but soon they grew louder, almost unintelligible, like voices murmuring from the farthest corners of the earth. I froze. My heart raced, and I instinctively took a step back. The whispers seemed to draw me closer, urging me to touch the stone. My eyes were fixed on the sarcophagus, and though I couldn't explain why, I felt compelled to open it. Slowly, I reached out and pushed the heavy lid. The stone scraped loudly against the rest of the sarcophagus, and the sound sent a shiver down my spine. Inside, there was nothing but darkness. I peered into the abyss, but before I could move, a cold gust of air rushed past me, slamming the door behind me with a deafening bang. The darkness inside the crypt seemed to close in, and I turned toward the door in a panic. I tugged at the iron handle, but it wouldn't budge. I was trapped. Suddenly, the air grew thick with an unbearable cold, and the whispers grew louder, more frantic. It was as if the crypt itself was alive, the voices echoing from all around me, surrounding me, choking the very air from my lungs. The sarcophagus lid slowly began to move again, and I could hear the faintest scraping noise as if something, or someone, was pushing against it from within. I backed away, my heart pounding in my chest. The whispers became clearer now, and I could hear the voice of a man, his voice rough and distorted, almost unrecognizable. "Let me out," he rasped. "I have waited so long." I couldn't move. My feet felt rooted to the cold stone floor as the whispering grew louder, more insistent. A feeling of dread filled the crypt, and I felt as though something unseen was circling around me, inching closer with every passing second. I turned to look back at the sarcophagus just as the lid finally creaked open. What I saw will stay with me for the rest of my life. A pale, skeletal hand reached out from the crypt, its fingers twitching like they were alive. I gasped in horror, stumbling backward as the thing inside began to pull itself out. The figure that emerged was not human. It was a creature, skinless, with yellowed bones and ragged clothing that hung off its frame like tattered rags. Its eyes were black, deep, empty voids that seemed to look right through me. The whispers now became screams, agonizing, desperate screams that filled my head and made it feel like it was going to explode. I ran, the sound of my footsteps echoing through the cemetery. I didn't dare look back, but I could feel the presence of the creature chasing me, its breath hot on my neck. The coldness followed me, suffocating me, and I could hear the thing's heavy breathing growing louder with every step. By the time I reached the gate, my legs were trembling, and my heart was pounding so hard I thought I would faint. I threw myself through the gate and into the safety of the town, the sound of the creature's screams still ringing in my ears. The next day, I tried to go back to the cemetery to make sense of what I had experienced. But when I arrived, I found nothing. The crypt was gone, vanished without a trace. The gravestones that had once dotted the cemetery were now arranged in neat rows, as if the whole place had been reshaped in a single night. I never spoke of what happened that night to anyone, not even to my aunt, but I know what I saw. The crypt of Ashford Hills was real, and the creature inside it, whatever it was waiting, hungry for freedom. I never returned to Ashford. The town and the memory of the crypt have been buried deep in my past. But sometimes, when the night is still and the wind is quiet, I can still hear the whispers, calling my name, beckoning me back to that forgotten graveyard. Some places are not meant to be disturbed. Ashford Hills is one of them. And the crypt still waits. It's always the ones you least expect that hold the darkest secrets. When I first moved to Marlow Hill, I didn't believe in ghost stories or superstitions. I thought they were just tales told to scare children or entertain people in dark corners of the local tavern. But after my experience at the Marlow Hill Cemetery, I'm not so sure anymore. Marlow Hill was a sleepy little town, tucked between towering trees and rolling hills. The kind of place where everyone knew everyone, and nothing ever seemed out of the ordinary. But there was one part of town that no one ever spoke about, the Marlow Hill Cemetery. It was on the outskirts, far from the hustle of everyday life, and the residents of the town avoided it like the plague. The old cemetery was known for its crumbling tombstones and eerie atmosphere, and every time I passed it, a chill ran down my spine. The most unsettling thing, though, was the story of the cursed grave, the grave of Annabel Tross. Annabel Tross was a name whispered in fear by the older folks in town. She was a woman who had died over a century ago, and some say she never really left. They say that her spirit was bound to the cemetery, trapped by some dark curse, and anyone who dared to disturb her grave would suffer a terrible fate. Of course, I didn't believe in any of it. I was new to town and eager to make a mark for myself, so I thought I would investigate the old cemetery and see if the stories were true. One autumn evening, when the sun was setting behind the hills, I decided to take a walk to the cemetery. It wasn't far, and I figured I could snap a few photos of the old gravestones for fun. The wind howled through the trees, sending leaves scattering across the dirt path. As I walked, the sun dipped lower, casting long, eerie shadows across the town. The air was unusually cold for this time of year, but I shrugged it off. Nothing strange was going to happen, or so I thought. I reached the cemetery as the last of the light faded from the sky. The gate creaked loudly as I pushed it open, the sound echoing in the stillness. The cemetery was quiet, too quiet. The tombstones were crooked and weathered, some of them leaning at precarious angles. A few were so old that the names had faded away entirely, leaving only patches of moss and dirt behind. But there was one grave that stood out from the rest. It was a large, imposing stone, much bigger than the others. Its surface was worn, but still readable. The name on the stone was Annabel Tross. The moment I saw it, an inexplicable shiver ran down my spine. It didn't make sense. There was nothing about the stone that seemed unusual. No eerie carvings, no strange markings. But there was something in the air around it. The feeling was unsettling, like the earth beneath my feet was alive, waiting for something to happen. I stood there for a while, staring at the tombstone. I could almost feel the weight of history pressing down on me. I tried to shake off the uneasy feeling, telling myself it was just my imagination. I'd read all the stories about the cemetery, sure, but they were nothing more than rumors, right? Annabel Tross was just another name on a gravestone. But something was different about this one. It wasn't just the tombstone. It was the silence. The cemetery seemed to be holding its breath, as if waiting for something. Suddenly, I heard a sound, a faint whisper, almost inaudible at first. I turned, expecting to see someone behind me, but the cemetery was empty. The whisper grew louder, clearer, and I realized it was coming from the direction of Annabelle's grave. My heart skipped a beat. I stepped closer, almost against my will, drawn to the sound. The whispers seemed to be calling my name, soft but persistent. Come closer. Come closer. I didn't want to, but I couldn't stop myself. It was as if something was urging me forward, guiding my steps until I was standing directly in front of the grave. The wind had picked up now, rustling the dead leaves around me, but the whispers continued. I could barely make out the words, but they were chilling. Release me. Release me. My pulse quickened. I felt a strange pressure on my chest, as though something was pushing down on me from above. The temperature had dropped drastically, and I could see my breath in the cold air. My instinct screamed at me to run, but I was frozen, rooted to the spot. The whispers were now louder, more urgent. Let me out. I've been waiting. Before I could react, the ground beneath the tombstone began to tremble. The earth cracked open, and a dark, black mist began to seep from the cracks in the ground, swirling like smoke. I stumbled back, my heart pounding in my chest as the mist grew thicker, filling the air around me. The whispers turned into a scream, a low, guttural wail that made my blood run cold. I watched in horror as the figure of a woman began to rise from the grave. Her skin was pale, almost translucent, her eyes hollow and sunken. Her long, dark hair hung in tangled strands around her face, and her mouth was twisted into a grimace of pain. Her hands, skeletal and bony, reached toward me, her fingers curling like claws. The scream grew louder, filling my ears as I backed away, terror seizing my body. The woman's voice, a shrill cry, pierced the silence. You should not have come. I turned and ran, my legs moving faster than I thought possible. The sound of her shrieking filled the air, echoing behind me. I didn't dare look back, but I could feel her presence closing in, her cold breath on the back of my neck. The ground felt uneven beneath my feet, and I stumbled, nearly falling. But somehow I kept running. The mist chased me, its tendrils reaching for my ankles, trying to pull me down. I could see the cemetery gate in the distance, but it seemed so far away. The whispers grew louder, the voice of Annabelle Tross still calling my name, begging me to stop, to return. My lungs burned. My body felt like it was about to give out, but I couldn't stop. Not now. Finally, I reached the gate, my hands trembling as I shoved it open. I didn't stop running until I was back at my aunt's house, panting and gasping for breath. I slammed the door behind me and leaned against it, my heart still racing in my chest. The house was warm, and the familiar sounds of the neighborhood felt like a distant memory. But I knew that something was wrong. For the rest of the night, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. I kept hearing the faintest whispers, as if they were just beyond the edge of my hearing. And whenever I looked out the window, I could have sworn I saw a shadow moving among the trees, watching me. The next morning, I went back to the cemetery with my aunt, but the grave was gone. Annabelle Tross's tombstone had vanished, replaced with a patch of fresh grass. There was no sign of the mist, no trace of the woman I had seen. It was as if nothing had ever happened, but I knew what I had seen. I knew the whispers were real, and the curse of Annabelle Tross was something far darker than anyone had imagined. Some graves are better left undisturbed, and some spirits are better left to their rest. I left Marlow Hill soon after that, unable to shake the memory of the cursed grave. But every now and then, when the wind is right, I can still hear the whispers, calling my name from the forgotten hills, beckoning me back to the cemetery that should have never been disturbed. Some places, some graves, are better left undisturbed. The curse of Annabelle Tross was real, and it is only a matter of time before someone else stumbles upon the grave that should never have been opened. It was a cool autumn evening when I first heard the stories about Thornhill Cemetery. I had just moved to the sleepy town of Thornhill, a place so quiet and still it felt as though time itself had forgotten it. Nestled between ancient trees and rolling hills, Thornhill was the kind of place where everyone knew everyone. The houses were old, their bricks weathered by years of harsh winds and rain. The streets were narrow and lined with tall iron lamps that flickered dimly at night, casting long shadows on the cobblestone roads. My new home was a small, charming cottage on the edge of town, just a short walk from Thornhill Cemetery. I'd heard the locals talk about the cemetery now and then, but they always did so with a certain caution, as though the place itself was something to avoid. At first, I thought it was just superstition, another small-town legend designed to keep children from sneaking out at night. But that was before I ventured to the cemetery myself. It was a Saturday afternoon when I decided to take a walk. The weather was perfect for it. The crisp air and golden light made the leaves of the trees shimmer as they fell to the ground. My curiosity got the better of me, and I found myself walking toward the cemetery. The gates, iron and rusted, stood tall at the entrance, as if they had been guarding the secrets within for centuries. I hesitated for a moment, but then, driven by an odd sense of intrigue, I pushed open the gate and stepped inside. The cemetery was eerily quiet. The ground was covered in thick grass, dotted with fallen leaves that crunched beneath my feet. Old, weathered gravestones stood at odd angles, some of them cracked, others leaning heavily toward the ground. The air was thick with the scent of earth and moss, and the only sound was the soft rustle of leaves in the wind. I walked deeper into the cemetery, my footsteps echoing softly in the stillness. There was something unsettling about the place, but I couldn't quite put my finger on it. Maybe it was the way the shadows seemed to stretch longer than they should have, or the way the wind seemed to carry faint whispers on its breath. It was a feeling I couldn't escape, a sensation that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand on end. I wandered past several rows of graves, some old, some newer, and then I came across a tombstone unlike any of the others. It was large, its surface smooth and polished, unlike the cracked, weather-worn markers surrounding it. The name engraved on it was Edward Thornfield, and beneath it, in smaller letters, was the inscription, "A man who gave too much." The moment I saw the grave, I felt an overwhelming sense of dread. I couldn't explain it, but the weight of it was almost physical. It felt as though something was pulling me closer, urging me to take a step toward the grave. I fought the urge, but it was as if the tombstone was calling me, whispering my name in a voice so faint I could barely hear it. I stood there for what seemed like hours, staring at the tombstone. I was just about to turn and leave when I heard it, a faint rustling sound from behind me. My heart skipped a beat, and I spun around, expecting to see someone standing there. But there was nothing. The cemetery was empty, as silent as it had been when I first arrived. I told myself it was just the wind, or maybe an animal moving through the underbrush, but the sense of unease lingered. As I turned to leave, I noticed something strange. There was a dark shadow near the base of Edward Thornfield's tombstone, moving in a way that didn't quite match the rest of the shadows in the cemetery. It was almost as if it was alive, shifting and swirling in the breeze. I took a step back, but as soon as I did, the whispering began. It was faint at first, like a distant murmur carried on the wind. But the longer I stood there, the clearer it became. The words were unintelligible, but the tone was unmistakable, frantic, desperate, as if someone was pleading for help. The whispering seemed to come from the grave itself, a soft, mournful voice that sounded as though it was buried deep beneath the earth. My pulse quickened. I wanted to leave, to run as fast as I could, but I couldn't tear my eyes away from the grave. Something about it kept me rooted to the spot, unable to move. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, and soon I could make out a single word, repeated over and over. "Release, release." My legs trembled, and I finally managed to turn away from the grave, my heart pounding in my chest. I walked quickly, almost running, toward the gate. But just as I reached the entrance, the ground beneath me seemed to tremble, and the air grew unnaturally cold. The gate creaked as if struggling to open, and the whispers followed me, growing louder, more demanding. "Release me." I reached the safety of the street, my breath coming in ragged gasps. I didn't stop to look back, but I could feel the weight of the cemetery behind me, pressing against my back. The whispers faded, But the feeling of being watched didn't go away. I didn't know what had happened, but I knew something was wrong with that grave, something far darker than I could understand. That night, I couldn't shake the memory of the whispers. They seemed to echo in my mind, following me even as I tried to sleep. I tried to convince myself it was just my imagination, that I had been spooked by the eerie atmosphere of the cemetery. But deep down, I knew I had felt something ancient and powerful, something that had been waiting for years, maybe even centuries, to be released. The next day, I asked the locals about Edward Thornfield. What I learned sent a chill through my bones. Edward Thornfield had been a prominent figure in Thornhill's history. He was a wealthy landowner who built the cemetery with his own hands, and it was said that he had a deep obsession with death and the afterlife. But what the townsfolk didn't know, or at least what they refused to acknowledge, was that Edward had died under mysterious circumstances. It was rumored that he had been trying to communicate with the dead, using forbidden rituals that drew on dark, ancient powers. Some said he had even sealed his own soul in the tomb, hoping to live forever. But something had gone wrong. The whispers, the voices from the grave, were not just the ramblings of a man lost to madness. They were the echoes of a soul trapped in an endless purgatory. Edward Thornfield had failed in his dark rituals, and now his spirit remained bound to the grave, unable to find peace. I decided that I had to return to the cemetery. I couldn't let it go. I had to understand what was happening. The next evening, I made my way back to Thornhill Cemetery, my heart racing with both fear and curiosity. The sun was setting, casting long shadows across the graveyard. The gate creaked as I entered, and once again, I felt the weight of the place descend upon me. The air was thick, charged with a strange energy, and the whispers were already there, lingering on the breeze. I made my way to Edward Thornfield's tombstone once more. As I stood there, the ground began to tremble again, and the whispers grew louder, almost deafening. I closed my eyes, trying to steady my breath, and that's when I felt it, a cold, clammy hand on my shoulder. I spun around, but no one was there. The air was thick with the scent of decay, and I could feel the presence of something, or someone, behind me. "Release me," the voice whispered again. But this time, it wasn't just the wind. It was a voice, a real, human voice, coming from the grave itself. My blood ran cold, and I turned to flee. But before I could take a step, the ground opened up beneath me. The earth split, and out of the darkness rose a shadow, a figure, tall and thin, with hollow eyes and a twisted grin. It reached for me with long, skeletal fingers. And then I woke up. It was a dream, or so I thought. But when I looked out the window, I saw the cemetery in the distance, bathed in the eerie glow of the moon. The whispers were still there, faintly on the wind, calling my name. I never returned to Thornhill Cemetery after that night. But every now and then, when the wind is just right, I can still hear the whispers calling, still feel the presence of something lurking in the darkness, waiting to be released. Some graves are better left undisturbed, and some spirits, once awakened, can never be put to rest. I had never been one to believe in ghosts or curses, at least not until I encountered something that defied all logic. It was a late autumn evening when I first set foot in the grounds of Hawthorne Manor, a place steeped in mystery and legends so thick they seemed to cling to the air. I was new to the area, just a young college student looking for an interesting project for my history course. The rumors surrounding Hawthorne Manor had caught my attention, and like most things that were whispered about in small towns, I thought they were nothing more than the result of overactive imaginations. But when I finally visited, I realized how wrong I had been. Hawthorne Manor was an imposing structure, perched atop a hill that overlooked the town below. The estate had been abandoned for decades, its windows dark and its iron gates rusted with age. The tall, crooked trees surrounding the manor seemed to protect it like sentinels, their twisted branches reaching toward the sky as though to hide the dark secrets buried deep within the land. And just behind the manor was the most notorious feature of all, the Hawthorne family crypt. The crypt had a reputation of being haunted. The townspeople spoke of strange noises at night, flickering lights, and the eerie figure of a woman in a black dress who was said to wander the grounds under the cover of darkness. It was rumored that she had died under mysterious circumstances many years ago and that her restless spirit remained, forever tied to the crypt, but none of it seemed real to me. I had always dismissed such stories as mere superstition, so I decided to visit the crypt myself. What harm could it do? The first thing I noticed as I approached the crypt was the oppressive silence that hung in the air. It wasn't just a lack of noise. It was as if the world itself had held its breath. The crypt stood at the far end of a small cemetery, tucked away behind a row of ancient oak trees. The stones surrounding the crypt were cracked and weathered, with the names of the long-dead etched in faded letters. The moonlight shone down on the scene, casting long shadows that danced across the worn paths. A sense of dread washed over me, but I shrugged it off. After all, I was a history student, and history was supposed to be about facts, not ghosts. I made my way through the cemetery, walking between the tombstones until I reached the entrance of the crypt. It was a simple structure, made of dark stone and heavy with age. The door was ajar, just slightly enough for me to peer inside. My heart began to race as I stepped closer. The air felt cold, unnaturally so, and a faint odor of decay lingered around the entrance. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up, but I pushed the feeling aside. Ghosts didn't exist. Curses were just stories. But as I stepped inside the crypt, I realized how wrong I was. The inside of the crypt was musty and damp, the walls covered in mold and the floor slick with moisture. A few faint cracks in the stone let in pale moonlight, illuminating a large, ornate sarcophagus at the center of the room. It was beautifully crafted, with intricate carvings of roses and vines, but it looked strangely out of place in the decaying crypt. My eyes were drawn to it, and I felt an overwhelming urge to approach it. It was as though the sarcophagus was calling me, beckoning me closer. I stepped forward, my heart beating faster with every step. As I reached out to touch the stone, a sudden gust of cold wind blew through the crypt, making the air feel even more suffocating. A strange sound echoed in the room, a low hum that seemed to come from deep within the walls. I froze, my hand hovering just inches from the sarcophagus. For a moment, everything stood still, and then I heard it, a soft whisper, barely audible, but unmistakable. "Leave." I jerked my hand back, my heart hammering in my chest. My first instinct was to run, to flee the crypt and never look back. But something kept me there. A strange, magnetic pull seemed to anchor me to the spot, and I couldn't tear myself away. The whisper grew louder, more desperate, now almost a wail. "Leave, before it's too late." I stumbled backward, my mind racing. But before I could turn to leave, the temperature in the room plummeted. I could see my breath in the air as it fogged before me, and an overwhelming sense of dread settled over me. The sarcophagus began to shift, slowly at first, but with increasing speed, as though something inside it was stirring. The carvings on the stone twisted, their once beautiful designs now contorted into grotesque shapes. The hum of the crypt became louder, more menacing, until it was a shrill, discordant sound that rattled my bones. I turned to run, but the door slammed shut with a deafening bang. The walls seemed to close in around me, the air growing thick and suffocating. A figure appeared in the darkness, a woman, tall and gaunt, with hollow eyes and pale, clammy skin. Her hair hung in long, tangled strands around her face, and her lips were twisted into a grotesque smile. She reached out toward me, her fingers long and thin, and I could feel the icy chill of her touch as she brushed against my arm. Her voice, barely more than a whisper, drifted into my ears. "You should have left when you had the chance," I gasped, stumbling backward, my hands fumbling for the door. But it wouldn't budge. The woman's figure loomed closer, her hollow eyes burning into mine. I felt her cold presence wrap around me like a vice, squeezing the breath from my lungs. I could feel the weight of her sorrow, her anger, and her desperation pressing down on me. "You are the one who disturbed her rest," the woman whispered, her voice like a rasping wind. "Now, you will pay the price." Panic surged through me as I fought to escape. I was trapped. The walls seemed to pulse, as if they were alive, closing in tighter with every second. My chest tightened, and my vision blurred as I gasped for air. I couldn't move. The woman's face twisted into a snarl, her lips curling back to reveal jagged teeth. The crypt seemed to come alive around me, the shadows dancing and reaching for me as if they were trying to pull me into the stone itself. And then, in the chaos, I saw something. A flicker of movement by the sarcophagus. Something was rising from it, something dark and ancient. A figure, tall and shadowy, its face hidden in the darkness. It raised a hand toward me, its fingers long and skeletal, and as it moved, the walls seemed to tremble. Without thinking, I lunged for the door, my hands gripping the cold metal handle with all my strength. I yanked the door open, and for a moment, I thought I had escaped. But the air outside was no better. It was thick, suffocating, and the whispers followed me as I ran. You cannot escape. You will never escape. I don't know how I made it out of Hawthorne Manor that night. I only remember running until my legs burned and my breath came in ragged gasps. When I reached the road, I didn't stop. I didn't look back. I never returned to the manor after that night, and I never spoke of it again. The whispers still haunt my dreams, and sometimes, when the wind is right, I swear I can hear them calling to me. Leave. I learned the hard way that some places are better left undisturbed. The crypt at Hawthorne Manor holds more than just the bodies of the dead. It holds something dark, something old, something that has been waiting for centuries to be freed. And the curse that surrounds it is real. So if you ever find yourself near Hawthorne Manor, heed my warning. Don't go near the crypt. Don't listen to the whispers. And whatever you do, don't open the door. Some things are better left in the dark. It was a damp autumn afternoon when I first saw Blackwood Hill Cemetery. I had just moved into a small cottage on the outskirts of town, far away from the noise of city life, and I was eager to explore my new surroundings. My neighbors, who were kind enough to welcome me with a homemade pie, warned me to avoid Blackwood Hill Cemetery. Not a place for the living, they had said in hushed tones, their eyes darting nervously toward the distant hill. At first, I thought it was just one of those strange, superstitious things people in small towns like to say. But the more I heard about the cemetery, the more curious I became. The townsfolk spoke of it with reverence and fear, as if the place itself was alive with a sinister energy that no one dared to challenge. It had been around for centuries, and even in the daylight, it looked unsettling. The cemetery sat at the top of Blackwood Hill, surrounded by towering trees that seemed to form a protective barrier around it. The stone gates, tall and rusted, were always closed, and a thick mist seemed to hover around the area, even when the weather was clear. One crisp afternoon, after hearing yet another story about the place from a local shopkeeper, I decided to see it for myself. I wasn't afraid of old legends. I was an open-minded person, someone who preferred to experience things firsthand before making judgments. And besides, I was intrigued. What could be so frightening about an old cemetery? I set out just as the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the town. The cemetery was only a short walk from my cottage, but the path leading up to it was steep, and I had to navigate through thick underbrush. As I drew closer, the air grew cooler, and the mist seemed to thicken. It wasn't anything I hadn't seen before, just the effect of the hill and the damp, foggy weather, but it did add to the eerie atmosphere. When I reached the cemetery gates, I was taken aback by how oppressive the place felt. The gates were even taller up close, and the iron bars were covered in creeping ivy. They were locked, of course, but there was a small crack in the stone wall where the ivy had grown through, creating just enough space for me to slip through. With a deep breath, I squeezed through the gap and entered. The cemetery was quiet, too quiet. The ground was uneven, and the gravestones were scattered in a haphazard way, as if the dead had been buried without ceremony or care. Some of the gravestones were so old that the inscriptions were nearly illegible, while others looked brand new, like they had been placed there just yesterday. There was no particular order to the cemetery. Some of the graves were clustered together, while others stood isolated in the distance. I walked deeper into the cemetery, my steps soft on the moss-covered ground. The further I went, the more I began to feel as if I was being watched. Every rustling leaf seemed amplified in the silence, and every gust of wind seemed to carry whispers. It wasn't just the typical sensation of being in an old graveyard. It felt different here. The trees surrounding the cemetery seemed to lean inward, their branches twisting like fingers, as if they were guarding something or someone. As I made my way through the gravestones, I came across an unusually large monument at the far side of the cemetery. It was different from the others. Tall and grand, it was made of black stone, its surface slick with age. At the top of the monument was a large, ornate crypt with a thick iron door. It looked out of place in a cemetery that was otherwise unremarkable, almost as though it didn't belong to this world. Curiosity pushed me forward, and I couldn't help but approach the crypt. The inscription on the base was worn and faded, but I could make out a few words: the Blackwood family. Below that, there were a few more words barely legible. Rest in peace, but never in silence. I didn't understand the meaning of the words, but they sent a chill down my spine. As I stood there, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was not alone. The air had grown colder, and the mist around me thickened. The trees groaned and creaked as though something was stirring within them, and the wind had picked up, whispering through the branches. Suddenly, the crypt door creaked open. I froze. The door wasn't supposed to open. It had been locked, or so I thought. But there it was, swinging slowly on its hinges, revealing a pitch-black interior. My heart raced, and I instinctively stepped back, but my feet felt heavy, like they were being pulled toward the crypt. It was as if something deep within the darkness was calling to me, urging me to enter. I turned to leave, but my curiosity got the better of me. What if there was something in there? What if there was something to the stories the townsfolk had told me? I took a deep breath, steeled myself, and walked toward the open door. The air inside the crypt was thick with an unsettling stillness. As I stepped over the threshold, a sudden chill ran through me. The walls of the crypt were lined with old wooden shelves, each one filled with dusty, forgotten relics, candles, books, and old trinkets that had likely been there for centuries. The crypt smelled of mildew and decay, and the faint smell of something else, a metallic, pungent odor that I couldn't place, hung in the air. I took another step into the darkness, and that's when I saw it. At the far end of the crypt was an ornate stone coffin. The stone was cold and slick with moisture, and a dark stain had gathered around its base. But what caught my attention wasn't the coffin itself. It was what lay on top of it. A pale, delicate hand reached out from the stone. Its fingers were thin and fragile, almost skeletal, and its nails were long and sharp. I gasped and stumbled back, but the hand seemed to move, slowly creeping toward me. I could feel my breath catch in my throat as the shadows in the crypt shifted, swirling around me like smoke. The cold seemed to intensify, and a whispering sound filled the air, faint at first, but growing louder with each passing second. "You shouldn't have come." I turned to run, but the door slammed shut behind me with a force that rattled the walls. Panic surged through me, and I scrambled to the door, but it wouldn't budge. The air felt thick, suffocating, as though something was pressing down on me, making it hard to breathe. The whispers grew louder, now surrounding me, echoing in my ears. "You shouldn't have come." Suddenly, the stone coffin began to shake. The lid slid off with a horrible grinding noise, and I saw the figure inside. It was a woman, pale, lifeless, her long hair tangled and matted with what looked like blood. Her eyes were wide open, empty and hollow, staring straight at me. I stumbled backward, my heart racing. The figure sat up slowly, her limbs jerking unnaturally. She turned to face me, her eyes locking onto mine, and for a moment, I felt as though I was being drawn into her gaze, as if she were pulling me into her world of darkness and death. "You shouldn't have come," she whispered again, her voice raspy and filled with anger. "Now you will join me in eternal silence." I didn't know how I managed to escape, but in a blind panic, I forced the door open, my hands trembling as I stumbled into the night. The air outside was different, lighter, fresher. I didn't stop running until I reached the bottom of the hill, my heart pounding in my chest. I never spoke of what I saw that night. I couldn't. I didn't know if anyone would believe me, and honestly, I wasn't sure I believed it myself. But I could never shake the memory of the woman in the crypt. The whispers, the cold, the way her eyes had locked onto mine. I never returned to Blackwood Hill Cemetery after that night, and I don't intend to. The Blackwood family crypt is still there, and I have heard stories from others who dared to venture near it. Stories of the same whispers, the same woman with hollow eyes, the same chilling presence that draws people into the crypt. Some places are cursed, and some graves should never be disturbed. I learned that lesson the hard way. If you ever find yourself near Blackwood Hill, I urge you, stay away. Because the crypt calls to those who listen, and once you step inside, there's no escaping its grasp. And the whispers? They never stop. They follow you, haunting your every step, until the darkness finally claims you, too. It was the kind of evening that makes you feel like the world has gone quiet, a gentle fog creeping in from the woods and settling over the town. I had recently moved to the sleepy village of Hollow Grove to escape the hustle and bustle of city life, seeking some peace in the countryside. Little did I know that my search for tranquility would lead me straight into the heart of one of the most disturbing experiences of my life. The village was small, nestled between rolling hills and dense forests. There was a sense of old-world charm to the place, but like all small towns, it had its share of secrets. Secrets the locals weren't too eager to share with outsiders. The most notorious of these secrets was Hollow Grove Cemetery. I first heard about it while sitting at a small cafe, chatting with an elderly woman who was a regular. Her name was Agnes, and she had lived in the village all her life. As I asked her about the local history, she grew quiet and glanced over her shoulder, as if making sure no one was listening. "You've heard about the cemetery, haven't you?" she asked in a low voice. I had heard rumors about it, of course. It was the oldest cemetery in the area, dating back to the 1600s, and was said to be haunted. Some claimed it was cursed, while others whispered about strange occurrences, voices in the night, figures seen between the gravestones, and lights flickering in the distance. But I wasn't one to put much stock in such stories. "Some say it's haunted," Agnes continued, lowering her voice even more. "But I know it's more than that. There's something wrong with that place. You should stay away." I was intrigued. The more she spoke, the more I realized that Hollow Grove Cemetery wasn't just another burial ground. There was something far darker lurking there, something that kept the townspeople away. My curiosity grew stronger by the minute. The next day, I decided to visit it myself. The cemetery was located on the edge of the village, hidden away in a thick patch of forest. It was a place that felt ancient, like time had forgotten it. The trees surrounding the cemetery were tall and twisted, their branches heavy with age, casting long shadows on the ground. When I first caught sight of the entrance, it almost looked like something out of a dream. The iron gates were rusted and barely standing, and the stone walls surrounding the cemetery were cracked and crumbling. The air was thick with the scent of damp earth, and the distant sound of birds was the only noise that broke the silence. I hesitated for a moment, standing just outside the gates, staring at the overgrown path that led into the cemetery. But something about it called to me, drawing me in. I pushed open the gates and stepped inside. The ground was uneven and covered with thick grass that made it difficult to walk without stumbling. The gravestones were old, many of them weathered beyond recognition. Some were cracked, some broken, and others had sunk deep into the earth. The cemetery had a neglected feel, as though no one had cared for it in years, perhaps even centuries. As I ventured deeper into the cemetery, I noticed something strange. There were no fresh graves. There were no signs of recent burials. The graves were all old, most of them from the 1800s or earlier. It was as if time had stopped in this place. And the deeper I went, the more I felt like I was walking through a forgotten world. I continued exploring, moving between the gravestones, each one more weathered than the last. There was an eerie stillness that hung in the air, as if the cemetery was holding its breath. The fog seemed to grow thicker the further I went, and a sudden chill brushed against my skin, making the hair on the back of my neck stand up. It wasn't until I reached the farthest corner of the cemetery that I saw it. A small, crumbling mausoleum stood at the edge of the cemetery, its stone walls covered in ivy. It was different from the other graves. This wasn't a typical family tomb. The mausoleum was much older, its design more elaborate, with intricate carvings that appeared to be ancient symbols. The door was ajar, and I couldn't resist the temptation to investigate. As I stepped inside, I was immediately struck by the coldness of the air. It was like a thick fog had settled inside the tomb, and the temperature had dropped by several degrees. The space was small, with a stone slab at the center, likely where the bodies of the deceased had once been laid. But what caught my attention was what lay on the far wall, a faded mural, barely visible in the dim light. It depicted a scene of a family gathered around an ornate grave, their faces distorted with fear. Above them was a dark figure, cloaked in shadow, its face hidden. I felt a strange sensation wash over me as I looked at the mural, as if it was alive, watching me, warning me. The longer I stared, the more I felt a presence, something just out of sight, lurking behind me. My pulse quickened, and I turned, half expecting to see someone standing in the doorway. But no one was there. It was then that I heard it. A faint whispering sound, so soft at first I thought it was just the wind. But it wasn't the wind. The voices were coming from somewhere deep inside the tomb, echoing off the stone walls. The whispers grew louder, becoming clearer, until I could make out individual words. "Get out." My heart pounded in my chest, and I spun around, desperate to leave. But as I turned toward the door, it slammed shut with a deafening bang, trapping me inside. Panic set in. I pulled at the door with all my strength, but it wouldn't budge. The whispers intensified, now sounding like a chorus of voices, all saying the same thing: "Get out. Leave this place. Now." The air grew heavier, suffocating, and I could feel my breath becoming shallow. And then, from the shadows in the corner of the tomb, something began to move. At first, it was just a shape, a figure in the dark, slowly emerging from the shadows. But as it came closer, I could see it clearly, a tall, gaunt figure, draped in tattered, dark clothing. Its face was hidden in the folds of a hood, but its hands, long, pale, and claw-like, reached toward me. I could hear it breathing, each breath ragged and uneven, as if it were struggling to stay alive. I backed away, my mind racing, but the figure continued to advance. "Leave," it hissed, its voice like the scraping of nails on stone. "You should have stayed away. You should have listened." I didn't know what to do. I was trapped, and the figure was getting closer. I could feel its cold presence pressing against me, suffocating me. My hands fumbled for anything to use as a weapon, but there was nothing. Just as the figure was about to reach me, the door flew open with a violent crash, and I stumbled out of the tomb, gasping for air. I didn't stop running until I was back at the gates of the cemetery, my legs trembling, my heart racing. I never returned to Hollow Grove Cemetery after that day, and I never spoke of it to anyone. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was still watching me, following me, waiting for me to return. The townspeople, of course, never mentioned the cemetery again. It was as if they had all agreed to pretend it didn't exist. But I knew better. The cemetery had a dark power, something that went beyond mere superstition. The whispers, the figure, the feeling of being watched. It all felt too real, too vivid. If you ever find yourself near Hollow Grove, I urge you, don't go near the cemetery. Don't even think about stepping inside. Because once you do, the voices will follow you, and they will never let you forget.